I had never been a cabin kind of guy. I liked civilization, the sound of cars on pavement, the glow of streetlights, the safety of knowing someone was always nearby. But life has a way of forcing you into places you don't belong. It was late September when I found myself standing in front of an old wooden cabin, deep in a valley, miles from the nearest town. The place belonged to my uncle, an old logger who had spent most of his life in the woods. He passed away a few months back, leaving the cabin to my dad, who in turn handed it off to me. I had no real attachment to it, but my father wanted me to check on the place before winter set in. The drive had been long, the roads winding and empty, and by the time I arrived, the sun was already dipping behind the hills. The cabin itself looked like something out of a history book. Weathered logs, a sagging roof, a porch that had seen better days. It sat on a small clearing, trees pressing in from all sides. The nearest neighbor, if you could even call them that, was at least 10 miles away. I pushed open the heavy wooden door, and the inside smelled of dust and old wood. A fireplace took up most of one wall, a pile of logs stacked nearby. A small kitchen sat at the back, and a narrow hallway led to a bedroom and a bathroom. The place was basic but livable. I dropped my bag on the wooden floor, kicking up a small cloud of dust. I wasn't planning on staying long, just a night or two, long enough to make sure everything was in order before heading back. The first few hours passed uneventfully. I went through my uncle's old things, checked the roof for leaks, tested the plumbing. Everything was fine, aside from the creeping feeling that the woods were swallowing the place whole. The trees were thick, too thick, their branches stretching over the cabin like fingers. By the time night fell, the air had turned cold. I built a fire in the old stone hearth, the flames crackling as they licked at the dry logs. The sound was oddly comforting, a small reminder of warmth in the vast emptiness around me. Then, at some point, I heard something outside. It was subtle at first, just a soft rustling, like wind through the trees. But then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, heavy, careful. I sat up, my heart hammering. It was pitch black outside, the kind of darkness that swallows everything. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and stepped toward the window. The trees swayed in the wind, their trunks casting long shadows across the ground. But beyond that, nothing. No movement, no sign of anything. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just an animal. Maybe a deer passing through, maybe a raccoon looking for food. But I didn't like it, not out here so far from everything. Still, I forced myself to lie back down, staring at the ceiling as the fire crackled beside me. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to silence. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows against the walls. I sat up, feeling an unease settle deep in my stomach, and then I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time. I reached for my flashlight, flicking it on and pointing it toward the window. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the front porch. There was nothing there, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. I stayed awake for a long time after that, listening, waiting, but the footsteps never came again. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. When morning came, the woods felt different. The trees seemed taller, the shadows longer. The air was still, the silence pressing. I stepped outside, my boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. I walked around the cabin, checking for tracks, anything that might explain the sounds from the night before. But the ground was undisturbed. No prints, no broken branches. I didn't like it. I went about the day as planned, making a list of things that needed fixing, clearing some of the overgrown brush around the cabin. But the feeling never left, that heavy, oppressive sensation that I wasn't alone. As the sun dipped below the hills again, I felt a deep dread settle in my chest. I didn't want to stay another night, but driving out in the dark, through miles of empty forest roads didn't seem like a better option. So I stayed, and that night the footsteps returned. This time they didn't stop at the porch. They moved around the cabin, slow, deliberate, like someone was circling the place. I held my breath, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I reached for the hunting knife I had brought with me, gripping it tight. Then something tapped against the window. Not a knock, not a scratch, just a single, deliberate tap. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I didn't sleep. When dawn finally arrived, I was still clutching the knife, my body stiff from tension. I didn't bother checking for tracks this time. I didn't want to know. I packed my bag, locked up the cabin, and got in my truck. I didn't look back as I pulled onto the narrow dirt road, the trees swallowing the cabin behind me. I never told my dad what happened, never mentioned the footsteps, the tapping, the feeling of something watching me from the darkness. And I never went back. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone. I had spent 30 years as a cop. I had seen the worst people could do to each other. I had seen blood, broken bones, and bodies left behind in ditches. I had been in shootouts, chased down killers, and stood over crime scenes where there was nothing left but silence. When I retired, I thought I wanted peace. I had no wife, no kids, and nothing tying me to the city. I wanted quiet. I wanted to be away from everything. So I bought a cabin. It was in northern Montana, miles away from the nearest town. The land was cheap, the forest was thick, and the winters were brutal. But I didn't mind. I had saved up enough money to last me, and I liked the idea of being alone. First, it was exactly what I needed. My days were simple. I woke up early, made coffee, and stepped outside to listen to the wind move through the trees. Sometimes I hunted, sometimes I fished. I spent my time fixing up the cabin, chopping wood, and keeping myself busy. I had a generator for electricity, a well for water, and enough supplies to last me months. For a while, I thought I had finally left the worst parts of my life behind. Then I started noticing things. Started small. A noise in the woods at night. A feeling that someone was watching me. First, I ignored it. It was easy to explain away. Wild animals, an overactive imagination, nothing serious. But it didn't stop. One night, I woke up to the sound of something outside. It wasn't an animal. I knew what animals sounded like. This was slow, deliberate. Footsteps. I grabbed my rifle and stepped onto the porch. The forest was quiet. The kind of quiet that wasn't natural. No wind. No crickets, just silence. I stood there for a long time, scanning the trees. Nothing, but the feeling stayed with me. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. The ground was soft from recent rain, and I found tracks. Human tracks. They circled the cabin, stopping just below my bedroom window. I didn't like that. I had spent years tracking people. I knew how to read footprints. The way the tracks moved told me this person had been careful. They weren't walking through my property by accident. They had been watching me. I spent the next few nights on edge. I slept with my rifle beside me, waking up at every sound. But nothing happened. The tracks never appeared again. Then one afternoon, I went to check my traps. I had a few set up deeper in the woods. When I got there, I found them empty. That wasn't unusual, but something else was. Someone had been there before me. The ground had been disturbed. Footprints, fresh ones. Someone had taken whatever I had caught. I didn't like that either. I started keeping my rifle with me at all times. I made sure my doors were locked. I checked my surroundings more carefully. Years as a cop had taught me to trust my instincts. Someone was out there. And they weren't just passing through. A week later, I found the first sign that things were getting worse. I was out chopping wood when I saw something nailed to a tree near my cabin. It was a rabbit, skinned, gutted, and pinned to the bark with an old hunting knife. That was a message. I took the knife and the rabbit down. The blade was old, rusted, and well used. I had seen knives like it before, cheap, the kind someone carried for years out of habit. I spent that night awake, rifle in my hands, watching the tree lean. Nothing. The next day, I decided to go looking. I spent hours tracking, following the prints where I could find them. Whoever it was, they knew what they were doing. They covered their trail, doubled back, moved carefully. But I had been doing this for decades. I knew how to track people too. The trail led me deep into the woods, farther than I had been before. Then I found it. A small clearing, a campsite. Someone had been living out there. There was an old tarp strung up between trees, a fire pit, and a pile of bones. Animal bones, mostly, but not all of them. Some were too small, too clean. I didn't like that at all. I searched the site, found nothing useful. No ID, no sign of who they were. Just a place where someone had been staying, watching. I made my way back before dark. I locked my doors. I waited. That night, I heard them. They were closer this time. Footsteps, slow, careful, circling. Then a sound at my door. A slow, dragging sound, like a knife against wood. I didn't move. I waited, rifle in hand, breathing steady. The sound lasted for minutes. Then silence. I stayed up until dawn. In the morning, I checked the door. Carved into the wood was a single word. Leave. I didn't. I spent the next few days watching, waiting. The footsteps kept coming. Every night, always just out of sight. Never close enough for me to catch them. Then one night, I heard something different. A gunshot. Not close, but not far either. Somewhere in the woods. I grabbed my rifle and headed toward the sound. Took me an hour to reach the area. I moved carefully, silently. Years of training kept me steady. Then I saw it. A man, slumped against a tree. He was dead. Had been for a while. Blood had dried around a wound in his stomach. He had been shot maybe a day ago. His face was rough, unshaven. His clothes were old, worn, dirty. His knife was missing. I searched his body. No ID. Nothing but a single piece of paper, folded in his jacket pocket. On it was a list of names. Mine was the last one. I burned the paper. I left the body. The woods would take care of it. I went back to my cabin. That night, the footsteps didn't come. The woods were quiet again. I stayed for another month, but nothing happened. No tracks, no signs, no more messages. Whoever he was, he had been hunting people. Maybe for years. Maybe just me. I didn't know and I didn't care. I had spent 30 years as a cop. I had seen the worst people could do to each other. I had retired to find peace. But some things never change, and I wasn't afraid of the dark. I don't know why I agreed to the trip. Maybe I was bored. Maybe I wanted to get away from the city for a while. Maybe I just felt guilty saying no to my stepbrother. We weren't particularly close growing up, but after our parents got married when we were both teenagers, we had to learn to live under the same roof. By the time we were adults, we were just two people who had shared a household once. Nothing more, nothing less. We kept in touch loosely, sending the occasional message, seeing each other at family events, but that was about it. So when he called me up and invited me to his cabin, I hesitated. He and his wife had bought the place a couple of years ago, deep in the forests of northern Montana. It was their retreat, their escape from everything. I wasn't sure why he wanted me there, but he insisted, said it'd be good to catch up. I finally said yes. The drive out was long, longer than I expected. I left early in the morning, but by the time I reached the last stretch of road, a winding, pothole-ridden dirt path surrounded by dense trees, the sun was already beginning to set. My phone had lost service miles ago, and the GPS had long since given up. When I finally pulled up in front of the cabin, I could tell it was far more isolated than I had realized. It wasn't just tucked away in the woods. It was deep in them. There wasn't another house or sign of civilization in sight. No power lines.
No fences.
Just trees in every direction. The cabin itself was a solid two-story structure, built out of thick logs. The windows were dark when I arrived, but as soon as I turned off my engine, the front door creaked open. My stepbrother, Mark, stepped out. He looked different. Older, obviously, but something about him seemed worn down. He was always a big guy, broad-shouldered, athletic, but he looked thinner now, like he'd lost weight in the wrong places. His beard was unkempt, and his eyes seemed tired. His wife, Julia, was in the doorway behind him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She gave me a small nod as I climbed out of the car. Something about the whole thing felt off. But I was here now, so I forced a smile, grabbed my bag, and followed them inside. The inside of the cabin was warm, but dimly lit. A single lantern on the dining table cast flickering shadows across the walls. There was a fireplace, but it wasn't lit. The place smelled faintly of pine and something else, something I couldn't quite place. Dinner was quiet. I picked at my food while Mark and Julia sat across from me, barely talking. Every now and then, Julia would glance at the window. I tried to make small talk, but it didn't go anywhere. Mark told me he'd been spending a lot of time at the cabin lately. He liked the quiet, liked being away from people. He didn't go into much more detail than that. Julia barely spoke. When dinner was done, Mark stood up abruptly. "I need to check the generator," he said. Julia flinched. I don't think I was supposed to notice, but I did. I offered to help, but Mark just shook his head and stepped outside. I watched Julia for a moment. She was staring at the table, her fingers tapping against her leg. "You okay?" I asked. She looked up quickly, forcing a tight smile. "Yeah, I'm fine." She wasn't. I didn't push it. A few minutes later, Mark came back inside. He looked a little on edge, but he didn't say why. Instead, he just grabbed another beer from the fridge and sat down on the couch. Julia disappeared into the bedroom without another word. I didn't sleep well that night. The bed was comfortable enough, but the silence outside was oppressive. No cars, no distant hum of city noise, just the wind through the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. At some point, I must have dozed off. Then I woke up. Something had jolted me from sleep. A sound. I lay still, listening. Silence. Then crunch. A footstep outside. I held my breath. Another crunch. Then another. Slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. I sat up carefully, heart pounding. "Mark?" I glanced at the clock on the wall.
3:12 Uhr nachts.
The footsteps stopped. I didn't move. For what felt like forever, there was nothing. Just silence. Then, just as I was about to lie back down, a soft tap, tap, tap against the window. I turned my head slowly. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of a figure standing just beyond the glass. Not moving, not saying anything, just there. I stared, frozen. Then nothing. The shadow shifted, then disappeared into the night. I barely slept after that. By morning, I was exhausted. Mark was already up, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee. Julia was nowhere in sight. I sat down across from him. He didn't look at me, just stared at his coffee. "You were outside last night," I said. It wasn't a question. He didn't answer. "Mark." His jaw tightened. Then, finally, he looked up at me. "I told you," he said. "I've been spending a lot of time out here. There was something in his voice, something heavy. I suddenly had the overwhelming urge to leave. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just grabbed my bag and told Mark I had to get back to the city. He didn't argue. Julia was still in the bedroom, but I didn't say goodbye. As I stepped outside, the morning sun cast long shadows across the ground. And that's when I saw them. Footprints. Not Mark's. Not mine.
Bare.
Human. Feet. Circling the cabin. I drove away and didn't look back. I never went back to the cabin. Mark and Julia stopped talking to me after that. I didn't push it. A few months later, I heard from my mother that they had sold the place, moved back to the city. She didn't know why, but I think I do. Some places aren't meant to be lived in. Some places don't want you there. And some things, if you're lucky, will let you leave. Once, I wasn't gonna test my luck twice. I never believed in the stories. I'd heard them growing up, tales of strange creatures that could mimic voices, twist their bodies in unnatural ways, and slip through the trees like shadows. But I never put much thought into them. It was just folklore, something the old-timers talked about when they wanted to scare kids around a campfire. That changed in the winter of 2018. I was working as a forestry surveyor in Montana, deep in the Bitterroot Mountains. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid well. My task was simple. Spend a few weeks out in the wilderness, mapping tree populations, checking for disease, and keeping an eye on the local wildlife. I'd done it for years, and I preferred the solitude. No cell service, no city noise, just me and the endless stretch of pine and fir. That season, my company had rented me an old cabin as a base of operations. It wasn't much, just a one-room structure with a wood stove, a cot, and a small kitchen area, the kind of place hunters used for shelter when the weather turned. It sat at the edge of a valley, about a mile from the nearest logging road. No electricity, no running water, just a lantern, a pile of split logs, and a radio for emergencies. I arrived in late November. The air was already sharp with the bite of winter, and the first heavy snowfall had blanketed the ground. My job would last 3 weeks, maybe 4, depending on the weather. After that, I'd pack up, head back to town, and spend the holidays with my brother in Missoula. The first few days were routine. I'd wake up before sunrise, pull on my gear, and hike through the woods, taking notes and marking spots on my map. It was peaceful. The only sounds were the distant caw of crows, the crunch of ice under my boots, and the occasional rustle of deer moving through the trees. But by the 4th day, I started noticing things that didn't sit right. The first was the smell. It hit me while I was trekking up a ridge, maybe 5 miles from the cabin. A stench so strong and rancid it made my stomach churn. It smelled like rot, like something long dead, mixed with the metallic bite of blood. At first, I figured it was a carcass, maybe an elk taken down by wolves. But I couldn't find the source. The smell seemed to drift, disappearing and reappearing on the wind. The second was the silence. The forest is never truly quiet. Even in winter, there's always some sound. Wind through the trees, the chatter of birds, the distant snap of a branch. But around the cabin, it was different. The silence was heavy, pressing, felt wrong. The third was the tracks. I found them near the tree line on the 6th morning. At first, I thought they belonged to a deer. They were deep, spaced apart, like something had been moving fast through the snow. But the shape was off. The prints were too long, the toes too spread out. And then I saw that they weren't hooves. They were feet, bare human feet. I told myself it was a trick of the light. Maybe the melting snow had distorted the shape. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. No one was out here. The nearest town was 20 miles away, and I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived. That night, I locked the cabin door. The next few days were uneventful. I forced myself to ignore the feeling that something was watching me, kept my head down, and did my work. But the unease lingered. Then, on the 10th night, I woke to the sound of knocking. It was soft at first, a slow, deliberate tap-tap-tap against the cabin wall. I sat up in the cot, heart hammering. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows against the walls. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it toward the window. Nothing, just darkness and the thick press of trees beyond the clearing. Then the knocking came again. This time it was louder, more insistent. It wasn't at the door. It was on the wall behind me. I grabbed my rifle. I wasn't about to open the door, but I wasn't going to sit there like a target either. I pulled on my boots, threw on my coat, and stepped onto the porch. The air was freezing, my breath curling in thick clouds. The snow reflected the moonlight, casting an eerie glow across the landscape. The woods were empty.
No footprints.
No movement, just silence. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, scanning the tree line, my fingers tight on the rifle stock. Then, just as I was about to go back inside, I heard it, a voice. It was distant, coming from the trees. "Help me." The words were stretched, broken, like someone trying to speak through a mouth full of gravel. I felt my stomach drop. It wasn't right. The way it sounded, it was wrong. Then it called again. "Help me." I turned and went inside, bolting the door behind me. That night, I barely slept. Every few minutes, I swore I heard something moving outside. The sound of crunching snow, the occasional soft scrape against the wood. But I didn't check. I didn't want to see. By morning, the tracks were back. They circled the cabin, uneven and erratic, like whatever had made them had crawled on all fours at certain points. I needed to leave. I packed my gear in record time, stuffing maps and journals into my bag, yanking on my coat. I had enough supplies to last another week, but I didn't care. I wasn't staying another night. The sun was barely up when I started hiking. The logging road was a mile away. If I kept a steady pace, I'd reach my truck in under an hour. But the feeling of being watched never left me. Halfway to the road, I glanced back. Something was standing at the edge of the trees, tall, gaunt, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It was watching me. I didn't stop. I didn't breathe. I just walked. I reached my truck, threw my bag in, and tore down that road without looking back. When I finally reached town, I checked into a motel and locked myself in the room. I sat there for hours, just staring at the door. I never went back to that cabin. A week later, my company sent another guy to finish the survey. He lasted 3 days before quitting. He didn't say why, but I already knew. I never planned on staying the night in that cabin. I wasn't even supposed to be in that part of the woods, but things never go how you expect. It was late October, the kind of cold that bites at your fingers and seeps through every layer of clothing. I had taken a trip out to a remote part of the countryside, not far from where my grandfather used to own land. The plan was simple: spend a weekend hiking, clear my head, and get away from everything for a while. I should have checked the weather forecast. The first day had gone fine. I parked my truck on an old dirt road and set off into the woods, following a trail that hadn't been used in years. I figured I'd find a good clearing to set up camp, maybe do some hunting in the morning. But as the sun started setting, the sky turned dark, thick with clouds. A storm was rolling in, and I was miles away from my truck. I didn't have much choice but to find shelter. That's when I remembered the old cabin. My grandfather had mentioned it once or twice when I was a kid. An abandoned hunting lodge, deep in the woods, built decades ago near an old graveyard. He always told me to stay away from it, said it wasn't safe, that it was falling apart. But right then, I didn't care about that. I just needed a roof over my head. By the time I reached it, the wind had picked up, and the first drops of rain were starting to fall. The place looked worse than I expected: old, weathered wood, a sagging roof, and a door barely hanging on its hinges. But it was shelter. I pushed inside and shut the door behind me. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of damp wood and rot. I pulled out my flashlight and swept it across the room. A single wooden table stood in the center, a rusted stove against the far wall, and a few broken chairs scattered around. There was an old cot in the corner, the mattress eaten away by time and whatever animals had gotten to it. I set my bag down and started gathering wood from the broken furniture, hoping to get a fire going in the stove. As I worked, the storm outside got worse. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, and rain pounded against the roof. I told myself it was just one night, just until the storm passed. But as I sat there, staring into the dim glow of my flashlight, I started noticing things. Scratches on the wooden floor, deep, uneven gouges like something had been dragged across it. The table had dark stains that had long since dried, too many to be from spilled drinks or old food. And the walls, there were carvings in the wood. Names, dates. Some were old, barely readable. Others looked newer. That's when I heard it. A sound from outside, barely audible over the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was steady, deliberate. Footsteps. I turned off my flashlight and stayed still, listening. The footsteps stopped. Just the wind now whistling through the trees. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was just the storm playing tricks on me. I waited a few more minutes, then turned the light back on. The cabin was empty, just me and the storm. I tried to sleep, but every sound kept me awake. The wind, the rain, the creaking of the old wood. Hours passed, and at some point, exhaustion took over. When I woke up, the storm had stopped. The air was still, too still. I sat up, stretching my stiff limbs, and that's when I saw it. The door was open. I knew I had shut it. I was sure of it. But now it stood wide open, the early morning fog creeping inside. I reached for my rifle, my hands shaking. There were tracks in the mud outside. Not animal tracks, footsteps, leading from the woods to the cabin. But here's the thing. There weren't any leading away. Whoever had been out there was still nearby. I packed my things as fast as I could, throwing everything back into my bag. My gut told me to get out of there. But as I stepped outside, I noticed something else. The graveyard. I hadn't seen it the night before. It was just a few yards from the cabin, hidden in the trees. Small, crumbling headstones, half buried in the earth. Some had names, others were just blank slabs of stone. And there, in the middle of them, was a fresh grave. The dirt was loose, recently disturbed.
No marker, no headstone.
Just a mound of earth, like someone had been buried there not too long ago. I didn't stick around to find out more. I followed my own tracks back through the woods, moving fast. I kept my rifle ready, every step feeling heavier than the last. I reached my truck just as the sun started to rise, threw my gear in the back and got in, locking the doors. But before I drove off, I looked back one last time, and that's when I saw him. A man, standing at the tree line, half hidden in the morning fog. Tall, thin, wearing clothes that looked worn and tattered. I couldn't see his face, but I knew he was watching me. I didn't wait to see what he'd do. I started the engine and got the hell out of there, gravel kicking up behind me as I sped down the dirt road. I don't know who he was. I don't know what happened in that cabin, and I don't want to know. But I'll tell you this, I never went back, and I never will. I never thought much about the old cabin until I had to stay there alone. It belonged to my uncle, a quiet, stubborn man who lived most of his life in solitude. He had moved out years ago, leaving it abandoned deep in the woods of Northumberland, barely touched except for the occasional visit to check if the roof was still standing. When he passed away, the cabin became my responsibility, though I had no desire to keep it. I lived in London, far removed from the stillness of the countryside, but I had taken a week off to drive up and sort out the place. The plan was simple: clean it up, list it for sale, and be done with it. A few days in the woods, away from the noise of the city, didn't seem like the worst way to spend a week. I was wrong about that. The drive up was long and uneventful. The weather was gray, as expected. Northumberland had a way of making the sky feel heavier, like the clouds were pressing down on the trees. When I arrived, the cabin was exactly as I remembered: small, wooden, and aged by the weather. It sat on a slight incline, backed by a dense forest that stretched for miles. There was no electricity, no running water, and barely any phone signal. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The musty smell of wood and dust hit me immediately. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and the furniture was covered with white sheets, like ghosts frozen in place. The fireplace was filled with old ash, and the single window in the main room barely let in any light. I spent the rest of the day cleaning. The hours passed slowly, the silence pressing against my ears. At night, I made a small fire in the hearth and ate a cold sandwich by the dim glow. Felt strange being there alone. Not exactly eerie, just unfamiliar. But I didn't dwell on it. It wasn't until the second night that I saw her. I had been outside, gathering firewood near the edge of the forest, when I noticed movement near the treeline. At first, I thought it was a deer or some other animal, but as I squinted through the trees, I saw her. A woman standing between the trunks, half hidden in the darkness. She wasn't close, maybe 30 meters away, but I could see enough. She was tall, her clothes dark and tattered, blending into the shadows. Her hair was long and unkempt, hanging over part of her face. She didn't move. She just stood there, watching. I stared back, waiting for her to say something, to explain why she was there. But she didn't. She didn't even shift her weight. She was still, too still. Something about the way she stood there sent a coldness through me. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. The nearest town was miles away, and the land surrounding the cabin was empty. No roads, no footpaths, just trees. I turned and walked back inside, locking the door behind me. I told myself she was probably a hiker who had wandered too far, maybe even a local who lived off the land. But that explanation didn't sit right with me. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every sound outside made me flinch. The wind moving through the trees, the creaking of the old wooden walls. At some point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, but I told myself it was my imagination. The next morning, I went outside to check. The ground was damp from the night rain, and sure enough, there were footprints leading from the forest to the cabin. Bare footprints. I stared at them, my stomach twisting. They led right up to the front steps and then stopped. There was no sign of them turning away, no indication of someone leaving. Just the prints, like someone had walked up to the cabin and vanished. I packed my things that afternoon. The plan had been to stay a few more days, but I had no desire to spend another night there. I locked the cabin and drove into town, booking a cheap room for the night. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. It felt ridiculous to bring it up. The next morning, I went back to the cabin one last time. I wanted to make sure everything was locked up properly before I left for good. As I pulled up the gravel driveway, something felt wrong. The air was still, the kind of stillness that makes you hold your breath. The front door was open. I knew I had locked it. I had checked twice, but now it stood ajar, swinging slightly with the wind. I stepped out of the car, my hands clenched into fists. Every instinct told me to leave, but I couldn't. I had to know. The inside of the cabin was unchanged except for the fireplace. The ashes from the old fire were disturbed, scattered across the floor. In the center of the fireplace, among the soot and dust, were footprints. Bare footprints. I turned and walked out. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, speeding down the dirt road, leaving the cabin behind. I never went back. I never put it up for sale. I never told anyone what happened. The cabin still stands there, alone in the woods, the door likely still swinging open in the wind. And maybe, just maybe, she's still standing there too, watching, waiting. I was never the kind of man who got scared easily. I grew up in the woods, hunting and fishing with my father, learning every trick there was about surviving in the wild. I knew how to track animals, how to skin them, how to read the land and the weather. There wasn't much that could shake me, but that hunting trip, the one where I stayed in the old cabin deep in the wilderness, changed something in me. It was early November, and I had planned a solo hunting trip up in northern Montana, not far from the Canadian border. It was a place I had been to before, miles away from any town, nothing but thick forest and cold air. The kind of place where you could disappear for weeks and no one would find you. That was exactly what I wanted, just me, my rifle, and the wilderness. I had a friend, a guy I knew from work, who owned a small hunting cabin way out there. It wasn't much, just a one-room structure made of old, weathered logs with a tin roof. It had a stove, a cot, and a small table with a few chairs. No electricity, no running water. Just the basics. That was all I needed. He had offered to let me use it before, and this time I took him up on it. The drive out was long, taking me down dirt roads that got worse the farther I went. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows over the trees. The air was sharp and cold. I parked my truck a short distance away and unloaded my gear. The cabin looked the same as I remembered. The logs were dark with age, the small windows smeared with dust. The door creaked when I pushed it open, and inside, the smell of old wood and damp air hit me. I set my pack down, checked the place for any signs of animals or squatters, and then started a fire in the stove. It didn't take long for the place to warm up. That first night was uneventful. I ate a quick meal, laid out my gear, and went to sleep early. I was up before dawn, rifle slung over my shoulder, boots crunching over frost-covered leaves as I made my way into the trees. Hunting in those woods was different from any other place I had been. It was dead quiet. No distant hum of cars, no voices, nothing but the wind in the trees and the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. I tracked a buck for hours, moving through the thick brush, careful with every step. Eventually, I got a clean shot and dropped it. Dragging the carcass back to the cabin was exhausting, but I managed. I spent the rest of the day cleaning it, cutting up the meat, making sure nothing went to waste. By the time I was done, the sky was darkening again, the cold creeping in fast. That was when I noticed something strange. The first thing was the footprints. Not mine, not animal tracks either. I spotted them in the dirt near the tree-line, just a few yards from the cabin. They were human, but they weren't fresh. The edges were softened, like they had been there for a while, but the pattern of them didn't sit right with me. They weren't leading anywhere, just circling in an odd, uneven path. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an old hunter had passed through days ago, maybe even weeks ago. I brushed it off and went inside. But then, later that night, as I was sitting at the table sharpening my knife, I heard something outside. A single sharp crack, like a branch breaking. I stopped, my hand tightening around the handle of the knife. The fire in the stove popped softly, but otherwise the cabin was silent. I waited, listening. Nothing. I went to the window, peered out. The darkness was thick, pressing against the glass. My truck was still parked where I had left it, the trees standing motionless beyond. I couldn't see anything unusual. I went back to what I was doing, but that feeling, that prickling sensation at the back of my neck, stayed with me. The next day, I went back out, but something felt off. The woods didn't seem as welcoming as they had before. I kept feeling like I was being watched. Every time I stopped to scan the trees, there was nothing there, just emptiness. At one point, I came across something that made my stomach twist. A deer, freshly killed, but not by a hunter. Its throat was torn open, deep gashes running down its side. The body was still warm. I had seen animal attacks before, but this wasn't normal. A bear would have eaten more of it. A wolf pack would have left different marks. This looked wrong, almost like something had just ripped into it and left it there. I backed away, rifle ready, scanning the trees. The silence was overwhelming. I didn't stay out much longer after that. Something wasn't right. That night, I locked the cabin door, loaded my rifle, and kept it close. I barely slept. Every little noise made me sit up, straining to hear. At some point in the early hours, I heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate. They stopped right by the cabin wall. I held my breath, gripping my rifle so tight my knuckles turned white. The footsteps didn't move. They just stood there. I don't know how long it lasted. Could have been minutes. Could have been an hour. Eventually, the sound moved away. By the time morning came, I had made up my mind. I was getting the hell out of there. I packed up my gear, threw everything into the truck as fast as I could. But before I got in, I saw something on the side of the cabin. A handprint, smudged into the wood. Large, too large, and the fingers were too long. I didn't stop to think. I got in the truck and drove, my heart pounding the whole way. I didn't look back. When I got back to town, I told my friend what had happened. He didn't say much, just listened with a serious look on his face. Then he told me something that made my skin crawl. He had never told me before, but he had stopped going to that cabin years ago, because something had followed him back one night. I don't know what I saw. I don't know what left that handprint, but I do know one thing. I'll never go back there, and I'll never hunt alone again. I had been staying at the cabin for 3 nights already. It was deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town, and the only road leading to it was a narrow dirt trail that twisted through the trees. It belonged to an old friend of mine, a guy I used to work with years ago. He had moved out of the country and let me use it whenever I wanted. I figured it would be a good place to get away for a while, clear my head, and enjoy some quiet. The first few nights were uneventful. The rain came and went in waves, light drizzles turning into heavy downpours before settling back down again. The sound of raindrops tapping against the wooden roof was oddly soothing, and the wind rushing through the trees made the whole place feel alive. The cabin itself was small but sturdy, built decades ago and showing its age in the form of creaky floors and a damp, musty smell that no amount of airing out could fix. I spent my time chopping wood, fixing small things around the place, and sitting on the porch watching the rain. It was peaceful in a way that was hard to find anywhere else. No cars, no people, no noise except for the wind, the rain, and the occasional distant crack of a branch snapping under the weight of the storm. That night, the rain was heavier than before. The air was thick and cold, and the wind had a sharp edge to it. I made a fire in the wood stove to keep the cabin warm, set up a lantern on the table, and ate a simple dinner. I checked my phone, but there was no service. There never was out here. It didn't bother me. If anything, it made the whole experience better. Sometime after midnight, I started hearing noises outside. First, I chalked it up to the wind. The trees groaned and swayed, branches scratching against each other like skeletal fingers. But then I heard something else, something different. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the rain. It was movement. It was subtle, just the faintest crunch of leaves, the soft snap of a twig breaking underfoot, the kind of sound a person makes when they're trying to move quietly. I sat still, listening. The fire crackled. The rain continued its steady drumming on the roof. But beneath it all, I could hear its slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. I stood up, careful not to make any noise. The lantern cast long shadows across the wooden walls, flickering slightly as the wind pushed against the cabin. I moved toward the nearest window, peering out into the dark. Nothing. Just rain and trees and the muddy ground glistening under the dim light of the overcast sky. The sound stopped for a moment, and then I heard it again, this time closer. Someone or something was just outside. I felt a slow, creeping dread settle into my gut. My first thought was an animal, maybe a bear or a deer, but the steps were too careful, too measured. It was a person. I grabbed the flashlight from the shelf and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the empty clearing in front of the cabin. The sound had stopped. I held my breath, waiting, listening, and then 3 loud knocks on the door. I nearly dropped the flashlight. The sound echoed through the cabin, deep and hollow against the wooden walls. I turned toward the door, heart hammering in my chest. I didn't move. I didn't answer. Whoever was out there stood in silence for what felt like an eternity. No more knocking, no sound at all, just the wind and the rain. And then, after what must have been a full minute, I heard the footsteps again, this time moving toward the window. I turned off the flashlight, plunging the room into darkness. The fire still burned, casting faint shadows, but I stayed completely still. The footsteps stopped right outside the window. I didn't look, couldn't. I just stood there, my back against the far wall, breathing as quietly as I could. The seconds stretched into minutes. The rain kept falling. The wind howled through the trees, but nothing happened. No more footsteps, no more knocking. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. I waited. 10 minutes. 20. Still nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, my back against the wall, eyes locked on the door. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I was exhausted but relieved. Whatever had been outside was gone. I stepped onto the porch, scanning the area. The ground was a mess of mud and scattered leaves, but there were tracks. Deep footprints leading from the trees to my door, circling the cabin, stopping at the window. I followed them with my eyes, heart pounding. They didn't lead away. Whoever it was, they hadn't walked back into the woods. There were no returning footprints. They had just disappeared. I never liked staying overnight at the worksite, but I didn't have much choice that week. My boss, Mike, wanted us to get the cabin finished by the end of the month, and the only way to meet that deadline was by pulling a few night shifts. The cabin sat deep in the woods, about 20 miles outside of town, up a winding dirt road that barely passed for a trail. It was a private build. Some wealthy guy from out of state had bought the land and wanted a secluded getaway spot. No electricity, no running water yet, just a shell of a structure in the middle of nowhere. We were supposed to finish the flooring, install the windows, and get the roof completely sealed before the real bad weather hit. I had been working all day with the crew, but they all packed up and left around 6 in the evening. My job was simple. Stay behind, keep an eye on the tools and materials, and make sure nothing got stolen. Not that I expected anyone to come this far just to swipe a few boards of lumber, but I was getting paid to be here, so I wasn't going to argue. The rain had started just after the guys left, a slow drizzle that made the half-finished structure feel colder than it should have been. I had a small camping stove, a thermos of coffee, and my sleeping bag rolled out in a dry corner of the cabin. The only light I had was from my flashlight, and I made sure to keep it close. The wind picked up around 9, and the rain turned heavy. It drummed against the unfinished walls, tapping against the plastic sheeting we had put up where the windows would be. The whole place groaned when the wind hit hard enough, the wood shifting like it wasn't sure if it wanted to hold together. I didn't think much of it at first. I'd spent enough time on job sites to know how unfinished buildings react to the weather. But something about that night felt different. It started with the sounds. First, I thought it was just the rain. When you're alone in the woods, your brain tries to make sense of every little noise, and sometimes it gets creative. But this wasn't just the wind or the rain. It was something else, something moving outside. I turned off my flashlight and listened. At first, it was subtle, just a soft crunch of gravel and dirt, like something stepping carefully around the cabin. Then another, and another. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the steps were too slow, too deliberate. Not like an animal that wandered into camp. More like something that was stopping, listening, and moving again when it thought I wasn't paying attention. I sat completely still, my heart pounding. The only weapon I had was the hammer I had left near my sleeping bag. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The sound stopped. I waited, counting the seconds in my head. Nothing, just the wind pushing rain through the trees. I told myself I had imagined it. Maybe my own shifting weight on the wooden floor had made a sound I wasn't expecting. Then I heard it again. Closer this time. I turned on my flashlight and aimed it toward the open doorway. The beam cut through the rain, catching only the wet trees and the mud beyond the cabin. I swept the light to the left, then to the right. Nothing. The rain poured harder, and for a moment I felt stupid. My nerves were getting to me. I had been on plenty of jobs in isolated places before, and I'd never spooked this easily. I turned off the light and laid back down. The moment I did, something hit the side of the cabin. Not hard, just a single, deliberate knock. I sat up so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. The hammer was already in my hand. My flashlight clicked back on. But again, I saw nothing. The knock came again. This time it was behind me. I spun around, shining the light at the plastic-covered window. The plastic shifted slightly, but that could have been the wind. I stepped closer, my boots heavy on the wooden floor. I didn't want to go outside. Every instinct in me told me to stay put, to wait until morning. But I also knew I wouldn't be sleeping if I didn't at least check. I took a deep breath and stepped out into the rain. The flashlight beam wobbled slightly as I swept it over the muddy ground. My truck sat where I had left it, the tires half sunk in the soft dirt. Nothing else looked out of place. I took a few steps away from the cabin, my boots sinking slightly into the mud. My breath came in short, sharp bursts, the cold air making my lungs ache. Then I saw them, footprints, deep, fresh prints in the mud, leading from the trees to the cabin. I wasn't alone. I followed them with the light, my pulse hammering in my ears. The prints circled the cabin, stopping at different points along the wall. Whoever had been out here had been watching me, moving from one side of the cabin to the other, waiting. The realization sent a wave of cold through me that had nothing to do with the rain. I turned back toward the cabin, gripping the hammer so tight my knuckles ached. My first thought was to get to my truck, but as soon as I aimed the light at it, my stomach dropped. The driver's side door was open. I was sure, absolutely sure, that I had locked it. I took a slow step toward it, every nerve in my body screaming. I shined the light inside. Empty. I swept the light around, but I didn't see anything. No one was there, but someone had been. I backed away slowly, scanning the tree line. The rain made it hard to see, the darkness beyond the trees impossibly thick. But I could feel it, that heavy, suffocating sensation of being watched. I moved back into the cabin and shut the door, wedging a board against it as a makeshift lock. My hands were shaking as I sat down with my back to the wall, the hammer still clenched in my fist. The rain kept falling. I waited. Minutes dragged into hours, and I didn't hear the footsteps again. The wind howled through the trees, the plastic sheeting over the windows flapping and snapping. I kept my flashlight pointed at the door, ready for any movement. At some point, exhaustion won. My head dropped forward, and I dozed off without meaning to. I woke up to daylight. The storm had passed, leaving behind a mist that curled around the trees. I stood up, my legs stiff, my back sore. The footprints were gone. The rain had washed them away, but I knew what I had seen. I checked my truck again. The door was still open, but nothing was missing. Whoever had been out there hadn't been after my tools or supplies. They had just been watching. I didn't wait around. I packed up my things, loaded them into the truck, and left without looking back. When I got back to town, I told my boss I wasn't staying at that site alone again. He didn't ask why. I never found out who had been out there that night. Maybe it was some local messing with me. Maybe it was a hunter who got too close. But I know this, whoever it was, they weren't lost. They knew exactly where they were. And they knew exactly where I was too. I never should have gone out there alone. At the time, it seemed like a good idea. Project to clear my head. A small cabin, nothing fancy. Just a single-room structure with a wood stove, a cot, and a desk. A retreat deep in the woods. Away from people, away from the noise. I'd always liked being alone, but this was the first time I tried something like this. I picked a spot far from town, about 20 miles from the nearest paved road. The land belonged to an old family friend who had no use for it. A mix of thick pines and rolling hills, dense enough that I wouldn't see another soul for miles. That was the appeal until it wasn't. I packed up my truck with supplies. A tent, an axe, a chainsaw, food, water, and a rifle. You don't go that deep into the woods without a gun. It wasn't fear that made me bring it, just caution. I'd seen bears out there before, coyotes too. The first day was all about setting up camp. I pitched my tent near a small clearing, just big enough for the cabin I planned to build. I marked the corners of the foundation, measured out the space, and made a list of trees I needed to cut down. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Peaceful. I remember thinking how nice it was to be away from everything. That feeling didn't last long. By the second day, something felt off. Started small, just little things that didn't sit right. Footprints in the dirt near my tent. Not mine. They were fresh, pressed deep into the soil. Too small to be a bear, too big for a coyote. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an old track I hadn't noticed before. That night, I heard something moving outside. A slow, deliberate crunch of leaves. Not the scatter of a small animal. Not the heavy steps of a deer. Something else. I stayed in my tent, gripping my rifle. Listened. The noise stopped after a few minutes. Morning came and I forced myself to focus on the work. Cut down trees, stripped the bark, and started stacking logs. Sweat poured down my back. My hands ached from gripping the axe. Hard work always made me feel better, and for a while I forgot about the night before. Then I found the bones. A small pile, maybe 10 feet from my tent. Stripped clean. A deer, most likely. But what bothered me was how they were arranged. Not scattered by scavengers, not left behind by a predator. They were stacked neatly, placed. I didn't touch them, just left them there and kept working. By the fourth day, the cabin had walls. Nothing fancy, just rough-hewn logs stacked and sealed with mud. The roof would take more time. Nights were getting colder, and I wanted it done before the first frost. That night, I woke up to the sound of something breathing outside my tent. Close, just inches away from the thin fabric. I held my breath, gripping the rifle tight. My heart pounded so hard I thought whatever was out there might hear it. Then silence. I stayed awake until dawn. When I finally unzipped the tent, there were marks in the dirt. Deep grooves like something had been dragged, leading away into the trees. I should have left then, packed up my gear and driven away. But I told myself it was paranoia, just the isolation messing with my head. I kept working. The next few days passed in a blur. The cabin took shape, the walls stood firm, the roof beams were in place. But the feeling wouldn't go away. That heavy, crawling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was watching. I checked the perimeter every morning, found more tracks, more signs that something had been near my tent. Never during the day, always at night. Then, on the 8th day, I found something new. Near the edge of the clearing, just past where I'd stacked the extra logs, there was a figure. Not a person, a shape made of branches, tied together with strips of bark. Human-like, but wrong. The arms were too long, the head too small. Someone had put it there, watching me. I knocked it down and burned it. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made my muscles tense. Every snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. I kept the rifle in my lap, finger on the trigger. The next morning, another one was there. Same place, same twisted shape. I stopped working on the cabin. My focus shifted to survival. I set up tripwires with empty cans, tried to stay alert, but the exhaustion was getting to me. On the 10th night, I heard it. Not footsteps, not breathing, a whistle. Low, slow, just a few notes drifting through the trees. I've never felt fear like that. I stayed inside my tent, staring at the thin fabric wall, waiting for something to happen. The whistle came again, closer this time. I gripped the rifle so tight my knuckles ached. Then, nothing. By morning, I was done. I packed what I could, left everything else behind. The unfinished cabin, the tools, the food. I just wanted to get out. The drive back felt longer than it should have. Every turn in the dirt road made me glance over my shoulder. Every shadow between the trees felt like it was watching. I never went back, never told anyone why I abandoned the project. Months later, I heard from the landowner. He asked if I'd left something behind. When I asked what he meant, he sent me a photo. The cabin was finished. Someone had finished it. I never liked the idea of staying in an isolated cabin, but my friend Darren convinced me. He had bought a small, run-down place deep in the woods, about an hour outside of town. He wanted to fix it up, maybe turn it into a rental or a hunting lodge. I wasn't too keen on the idea, but he offered me a weekend out there, no work, just a quiet getaway. I had been dealing with a lot lately, so I agreed. The plan was simple. I'd drive up Friday afternoon, spend 2 nights, and leave early Sunday morning. I packed light, some canned food, a few beers, my sleeping bag, and a flashlight. Darren had assured me the place had basic amenities, but I wasn't expecting much. The drive out was uneventful. The road leading to the cabin was a narrow dirt path, bumpy and overgrown in places. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. Trees stretched high on either side, their thick branches blotting out most of the daylight. It gave me an uneasy feeling, but I pushed it aside. By the time I arrived, the sun was already dipping low. The cabin was small, old, and weathered, sitting in a clearing surrounded by dense forest. A thin layer of mist clung to the ground, and the trees loomed like silent watchers. The place had a single door, one window in the front, and a tiny porch with a couple of broken steps leading up to it. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled of damp wood and dust. The interior was bare. Just a wooden table, a few chairs, and a small cot in the corner. There was no electricity, just an old gas lantern and a wood-burning stove. The place felt abandoned, but it was quiet, peaceful in a way. I set my bag down, lit the lantern, and checked my phone. No service. I wasn't surprised, but it made me uneasy. Still, I told myself it was just a couple of nights. I ate a quick meal, had a beer, and sat on the porch, watching the last bit of sunlight disappear behind the trees. The forest was silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, just an overwhelming stillness. I went inside, locked the door, and crawled into my sleeping bag. The cot was uncomfortable, but I was tired. I lay there in the dark, listening. Nothing. No crickets, no owls, no distant animal sounds. Just silence. Took me a long time to fall asleep. Sometime during the night, I woke up. A sound outside. Faint, distant, like something moving through the trees. I held my breath, listening. It was slow, deliberate. Not an animal. It sounded like footsteps. I sat up and reached for my flashlight, heart pounding. The sound stopped. The cabin was pitch dark. The lantern had burned out. I stayed still, listening. Minutes passed. Nothing. Just my own breathing. I told myself it was just my imagination. I lay back down, but sleep wouldn't come. I kept thinking about those footsteps. If it had been an animal, I would have heard it moving around more. But the sound had stopped completely. Like whoever or whatever was out there had been listening too. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around. Nothing seemed disturbed. The ground was covered in fallen leaves. No clear tracks. But the feeling of being watched lingered. I shook it off and went about my day. I chopped some wood, explored the area a bit, and tried to enjoy the quiet. But the silence felt unnatural, like the forest was holding its breath. As the day wore on, I felt more and more uneasy. Every time I turned my back, I felt like someone was there, watching. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was never anything there. That evening, I decided to keep the lantern on all night. I didn't want to wake up in total darkness again. I barely slept. Sometime after midnight, I heard the footsteps again, closer this time, slow, measured, circling the cabin. I sat up, gripping my flashlight. The lantern cast flickering shadows on the walls. Then a sound, soft, deliberate, the doorknob turning. My stomach dropped. I grabbed the hatchet I had brought for chopping wood and crept toward the door. I held my breath, listening. The knob rattled again, harder this time. I forced myself to look out the window. The porch was empty, but just beyond the lantern's reach, in the tree line, something moved. A shape, barely visible. Person. I ducked down, my pulse hammering in my ears. I didn't know what to do. If I ran, they could be waiting outside. If I stayed, they could try to break in. Minutes dragged by. The knob stopped rattling. The footsteps moved away. I stayed awake until dawn. When the first light broke through the trees, I grabbed my things, threw them into my bag, and stepped outside. The forest felt different now, more open, less suffocating. I looked around, scanning the tree line. Nothing. I walked to my car, my ears straining for any sound. Just as I reached the driver's side door, I saw it. A single footprint, too big to be mine, too fresh to be old. I didn't waste another second. I jumped in, started the engine, and tore down the dirt road, not looking back. I didn't tell Darren what happened. I just said the cabin wasn't for me. I don't know who was out there that night or what they wanted. But I know one thing, they weren't just passing through. I was 34 when I took the job. It wasn't the kind of work I imagined myself doing at this point in my life, but things had a way of shifting unexpectedly. I had spent most of my 20s working in construction, bouncing from one site to another, and by my 30s, I wanted something quieter, something that didn't involve city traffic and long commutes. So when a friend told me about a seasonal caretaker job for an isolated hunting lodge deep in the hills of Montana, I figured, why not? The owner was an older man, barely ever visited the place anymore. His family had passed it down for generations, but he lived in another state and only used it for hunting trips maybe once a year. The job was simple. Keep the place maintained through the fall and winter, make sure the pipes didn't freeze, keep animals from getting in, and report anything that needed fixing. In exchange, I got free lodging, decent pay, and all the solitude I could ask for. Sounded easy. Too easy. The drive up was long. The dirt road twisted up through miles of dense pine forests. The trees packed so tightly together that barely any light got through. The further I went, the less the road looked maintained. By the time I reached the cabin, my truck's tires were kicking up rocks the size of my fist. The place itself was bigger than I expected. A 2-story log cabin, built solid, sitting at the edge of a clearing surrounded by thick woods. There was a shed out back, an old hunting tower about 50 yards away, and a generator shack tucked against the tree line. The guy before me had already packed up and left, so it was just me. I settled in, checked the place over. The cabin smelled of old wood and dust, but it was stocked well. Canned food, water, even a rifle and some ammo in case I needed it. The first few days were uneventful. I went about my work, cleared some deadfall from the yard, made sure the generator was running fine. The air was crisp, cold even for late September, and at night, the wind howled through the trees like something alive. Then small things started to happen. The first was the feeling. I'd be outside chopping wood or making my rounds, and suddenly, I'd feel watched. Not in a paranoid, imaginary way, but in a deep, gut-level, something is right there kind of way. It was the kind of sensation you don't ignore, the one that tightens your chest and makes the hairs on your arms stand up. But every time I turned, nothing was there. Then came the noises. At first, they were easy to dismiss. A tree creaking in the wind, branches snapping in the distance, the usual forest sounds. But they got closer. One night, just as I was drifting off, I heard something shuffle across the porch. A slow, deliberate sound, like heavy boots on wood. I sat up, heart hammering. The rifle was next to the bed. I grabbed it, stood up as quietly as I could. The cabin was pitch dark, the only light coming from the dying embers in the fireplace. I listened, every muscle tense. Nothing. I moved to the window, peered out. The porch was empty. The yard, the tree line, nothing but shadows. But I knew what I heard. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt just below the porch steps. Not boot prints, bare feet, human, but something was off. The toes were too long, the arch too high, and they weren't deep, like someone had just lightly placed their feet down without actually shifting their weight. I didn't like that. That day, I checked the entire property, walked the perimeter, searched the woods for signs of squatters, hikers, anything that might explain what I'd seen. But there was nothing. No camps, no discarded trash, no trails leading away, just untouched forest stretching for miles. I locked the doors that night, bolted the windows, kept the rifle within arm's reach. The next few nights, nothing happened. The woods were quiet, too quiet.
No owls, no crickets.
Just silence. Then, on the 6th night, I woke up to something tapping on the window. Not knocking, not scraping, tapping. Slow, deliberate, like fingertips drumming against the glass. I stayed still, barely breathing. The sound moved from one window to the next, a slow circuit around the cabin. Then it stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I was done ignoring it. I checked the entire cabin again, inside and out. The ground beneath the windows was undisturbed. No prints this time, no signs of anything, but I knew what I heard. I started keeping the lights on at night. Didn't matter how much fuel the generator used. I wasn't sitting in the dark anymore. I set up makeshift alarms, tied cans to strings across the porch. If something stepped up there again, I'd know. A few nights later, they went off. I shot out of bed so fast I nearly tripped over the rifle. The cans clattered across the porch, the strings snapping. I rushed to the window, but by the time I got there, the yard was empty. The wind had picked up, bending the trees, making the shadows dance. But there was something else. Something out there in the tree line, just beyond the reach of the light. I stared hard, my pulse thudding in my ears. Then movement. Not a deer, not a bear. Something tall, standing between the trunks. I could barely make it out. A shape, motionless, just watching. I gripped the rifle, willing myself to move, but I didn't. I just stood there, frozen. Then slowly it turned and walked away. I stayed awake until dawn. That morning, I made a decision. I packed up. Didn't care about the job anymore. Didn't care about finishing out the season. I threw my gear into the truck, made sure the rifle was loaded, and left. I didn't look back. By the time I reached the nearest town, my hands were still shaking. I found a payphone, called the owner, told him something was out there. I didn't stay to argue, just left the keys with a local shopkeeper and drove. I never went back. A few weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I checked the local news, half expecting a story about missing hikers or strange sightings. But there was nothing, just a forgotten cabin in the hills, sitting empty, waiting for the next caretaker, waiting for someone else to hear the tapping on the glass. I never thought I'd be back in that cabin again. Not after what happened the last time. It was late September, the kind of time when summer is long gone, but winter hasn't fully set in yet. The trees were turning, leaves scattered across the dirt road as I drove up the narrow path toward the woods. The place had been in my family for years, a small one-room cabin my grandfather built back in the 50s. I'd spent time there as a kid, learned how to hunt and fish in those woods, but I hadn't been back in years. I had a long weekend off work and figured I could use the break. The cabin wasn't much, just 4 walls, a roof, and an old wood stove, but it was enough. I packed light, just some food, a sleeping bag, and a rifle. I'd planned to do some hunting, maybe clear my head for a bit. It had been a rough year. The sun was already getting low when I pulled up to the clearing. The cabin sat where it always had, nestled between thick pines, the wood darkened with age. I killed the engine, stepping out into the crisp air. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no wind rustling the trees, just stillness. I grabbed my bag and stepped inside. The place smelled the same, old wood, dust, and the faint scent of the forest creeping in through the cracks. The air felt heavy, but I told myself it was just in my head. I set up my gear, lit a fire in the wood stove, and sat for a while, listening to the crackling flames. Night fell fast in the woods, and before I knew it, it was pitch black outside. I could hear the occasional creak of the trees shifting in the wind, but that was normal. I should have felt relaxed. Instead, I felt watched. At first, I thought it was just me being alone in the woods after so long. I wasn't used to it anymore. I brushed the feeling off, made myself some food, and tried to settle in. Then I heard it, a crunch. Not from inside the cabin, from outside. I froze, listened. Another crunch, this time closer. Footsteps. I reached for my rifle. I wasn't scared, not yet, but I wasn't stupid either. I knew the area, knew the kind of animals that roamed these woods. This didn't sound like an animal. It was slow, deliberate, like someone was moving carefully, trying not to be heard. I stood up, moving toward the window, careful not to make noise. The fire inside made it impossible to see out, but I knew if anyone was out there, they could see me clear as day. I killed the fire. The cabin fell into darkness. I waited, barely breathing. The footsteps had stopped. I stood there for what felt like an hour, rifle in hand, staring out the window into the dark. Nothing. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe a branch had fallen. Maybe I was just out of practice, letting my nerves get the best of me. I went to bed, but I didn't sleep. Every little sound kept me on edge. A branch shifting, the wind brushing against the roof. My grip stayed firm on the rifle. I kept my ears open, waiting. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of something tapping against the wall. Not scratching, not an animal. Tap, like a knuckle against wood. It was right outside. I sat up, heart pounding. The rifle was already in my hands. I listened, waiting for it to happen again. Silence. Then, a slow drag, something brushing against the cabin's wall. I moved carefully, crawling toward the window, trying to see without being seen. I didn't dare turn on a light. My fingers tightened around the rifle. Then I saw it. A shape, tall, thin, standing just beyond the tree line. Not moving, just watching. The fire inside me turned to ice. My breath caught in my throat. Whoever it was, they weren't making a sound. They were just standing there, watching. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move. I stepped back from the window, heart hammering against my ribs. If they were watching, I wouldn't give them the advantage. I crept toward the door, listening. If they tried to come inside, they'd have to go through me first. Then the sound came again, but this time it was on the other side of the cabin. Tap, then a slow drag. There were two of them. My blood ran cold. I gripped the rifle tighter, forcing myself to stay calm. I wasn't dealing with some random hiker who got lost. These people, whoever they were circling the cabin. I wasn't going to wait to find out what they wanted. I moved fast, throwing the door open and stepping out, rifle raised. Nothing. The woods were empty. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves. My eyes darted from tree to tree, scanning for movement. Then I saw it again. The shape, standing further back this time, still watching. I raised the rifle. Leave. I didn't shout. I didn't threaten. Just one word. They didn't move. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, heart hammering, waiting. Then, without a sound, they stepped back, disappearing into the trees. I didn't wait. I backed into the cabin, locked the door, and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When morning came, I packed my things. I stepped outside, rifle in hand, scanning the woods. Nothing. But as I turned toward my truck, I stopped cold. There, in the dirt right outside my window, footprints. Dozens of them. Some fresh, some old. They had been watching the cabin for a long time. I never went back after that. I had done a lot of things I wasn't proud of, but this job was different. It wasn't like the usual runs. No quick handoffs, no easy cash, no simple in and out. This was the kind of thing that could go wrong in ways I didn't want to think about. But I was in deep now, too deep to walk away. Started with a name, Gregorio. No last name, no history, just a man with money who needed something done. And when a guy like Gregorio offers a job, you don't ask questions. You take the job, you take the cash, and you do what you're told. The job was simple on paper. Drive out to a cabin in the woods, pick up a package, and deliver it to a warehouse on the outskirts of town. That's all I was given.
No detalhes, no varnings, no explanations.
But I knew better than to believe anything was ever that easy. I drove through the night, the highway stretching out in front of me like an endless black ribbon. The city lights disappeared behind me, swallowed up by the dark. The further I went, the quieter it got. No traffic, no streetlights, just empty road and the hum of my engine. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights trailing me. Nothing. The turnoff was nearly invisible, just a break in the tree line. If I hadn't been looking for it, I would have missed it completely. The road was rough, nothing but dirt and gravel, the kind of place people only went when they didn't want to be found. My tires kicked up dust as I made my way deeper into the woods, the trees closing in on both sides. The air smelled damp, like rain had passed through recently, but the ground was dry. I didn't like this, not one bit. The cabin appeared through the trees, barely visible in the moonlight. It was old, the wood dark and rotting in places, the windows cracked or boarded up. There was no sign of life, no lights, no movement. Just an empty, dead-looking place sitting in the middle of nowhere. I pulled up slowly, killed the engine, and sat there for a moment. My fingers drummed against the steering wheel. Something about this didn't feel right. I could feel it in my gut. I had been in this game long enough to know when something was off. And this was bad. I got out of the car, the crunch of gravel under my boots sounding too loud in the silence. The woods were still, no wind, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just dead silence. I walked up to the cabin, testing each step on the porch before putting my weight down. The wood groaned under me. The door was unlocked. It swung open with a slow creak. The smell hit me first. Coppery, metallic, blood. Not old blood either. Fresh. My stomach tightened. Inside, the place was a mess. Furniture overturned, papers scattered across the floor, a chair lying on its side with a broken leg. Signs of a struggle. And then I saw it. A body, face down, blood pooling underneath. The back of his head was gone, like someone had pressed a shotgun against his skull and pulled the trigger. I stepped closer, careful where I put my feet. His hands were bound behind his back with thick zip ties. This wasn't random. This was a message, and I had just walked into it. I turned, scanning the room. No sign of the package I was supposed to pick up. No sign of anyone, but someone had been here, and whoever they were, they had left in a hurry. I took a step back, my pulse hammering in my ears. That's when I heard it. A car, not mine. The sound was distant, but getting closer. Tires on gravel. Slow, careful. Someone was coming. I moved quickly, stepping over the body and heading toward the back door. It opened with a low groan, revealing more darkness. The woods stretched out behind the cabin, dense and endless. I had two choices, run or stay and find out who was coming. I chose the first. I moved fast, slipping into the trees. The second I was out of sight, I crouched low, steadying my breathing. The car came to a stop. A door opened, then another. More than one person. Boots on wood. The porch creaked. Voices. Low, careful. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but I knew what they were thinking. They weren't here to clean up. They were here to make sure no one else knew what had happened. I needed to get out. Fast. I kept low, moving through the trees. Every step was slow, careful. One wrong move, one snapped twig, and I'd be done. My car was still at the cabin, but there was no way I was going back for it. I had to find another way out. Then I heard it. A click. Not a gun. A flashlight. Someone was coming into the woods. I pressed myself against a tree, barely breathing. The light moved slowly, sweeping side to side. They were looking for something, looking for me. I stayed still. Seconds passed like hours. Then the light moved away, the footsteps fading. They hadn't seen me. Not yet. I waited. 5 minutes, then 10. When I was sure they were gone, I moved. Slow, quiet, careful. I didn't stop. Not until I reached the highway. Not until I saw the first sign of civilization. I walked for miles, my muscles burning, my throat dry. I didn't look back. When I finally reached town, I found a payphone, dialed a number I knew by heart. When the voice on the other end answered, I only said one thing: "The job's off." Then I hung up and kept walking. I didn't know who had set me up or why, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to that cabin. Not ever. I never planned to go back to my uncle's cabin. It was one of those places you think about sometimes but never actually return to. The kind of place that exists only in old stories told over beers, in the back of your mind when you're half asleep, or when you're driving down a lonely road in the dark. But after my uncle passed, the cabin became mine, and ignoring it wasn't an option anymore. I was 34 when I made the trip out there, in the middle of November. The drive alone was enough to remind me why my uncle had chosen to live so far from civilization. Miles of cracked roads, overgrown trees leaning too close to the asphalt, old wooden signs with the lettering worn away. It was the kind of place where phone service disappeared 20 minutes before you arrived. By the time I turned onto the dirt road leading to the cabin, the sun had started dipping below the tree line, throwing long, thin shadows across the ground. The place looked smaller than I remembered. A single-story wooden structure with a sagging porch, the paint peeling from the walls, the windows dark like empty eye sockets. The wind had stripped most of the trees bare, leaving the forest floor thick with dead leaves. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, the silence pressing in around me. No hum of traffic, no distant voices, no background noise. Just the wind moving through the trees and the creaking of the car as it cooled. The key was stiff in the lock, and the door groaned as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale and thick with the scent of dust and old wood. My uncle hadn't been there in months before he died, and it showed. A thin layer of dust coated the furniture, and the stone fireplace was cold and empty. I flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. Of course, the power was out. I set my bags down near the door and grabbed the flashlight from my coat pocket. The beam cut through the dimness, illuminating the small living room. An old couch pushed against the wall, a wooden coffee table covered in old magazines, the mounted deer head above the fireplace staring blankly ahead. The kitchen was just as I remembered, with its rusted sink, chipped countertops, and the wood-burning stove my uncle had insisted on using instead of a modern oven. I checked the bedroom next, flipping the mattress over before dropping my sleeping bag on top of it. The thought of sleeping on something that had been sitting untouched for months made my skin crawl. The cabin only had one other room, a storage area packed with old hunting gear, stacks of firewood, and boxes of who knows what. After lighting a few old lanterns, I headed outside to bring in more firewood. The cold had a sharp edge to it, the kind that bit through your clothes and settled into your bones. I stacked the wood inside, set up a fire, and settled into the creaky old chair by the hearth. The warmth helped, but the unease never left. I didn't want to admit it, but something felt wrong. At first, I chalked it up to being alone in a place I hadn't seen in years. The silence was different than I remembered. Not peaceful, but expectant, like the woods were waiting for something. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself I was just being paranoid. Then I heard the footsteps, faint at first, barely more than a whisper of movement outside. A slow, deliberate crunch of leaves. I held my breath, straining to hear over the crackling fire. The sound came again, closer this time. My first thought was an animal, a deer maybe, but deer didn't move like that. They didn't pause between steps as if listening. They didn't stop just outside the window, standing still for minutes at a time. I stood, moving slowly toward the window, careful not to make a sound. The lantern's glow barely reached beyond the porch, leaving most of the yard shrouded in darkness. I squinted, trying to make out shapes in the trees. Nothing. Just as I started to turn away, I heard it again, this time from the back of the cabin. I grabbed my uncle's old shotgun from above the fireplace, my pulse hammering in my ears. It wasn't loaded, but whoever was out there didn't need to know that. I moved to the back door, pressing my ear against the wood. Silence. Then, just as I started to convince myself I'd imagined it, a single, deliberate knock. Not loud, not frantic, just patient. I don't know how long I stood there, gripping the shotgun so tight my fingers ached. My breathing felt too loud, the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my skull. Then another knock. I backed away, moving to the window, lifting the edge of the curtain just enough to see outside. Nothing. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting, but the knocks didn't come again. Eventually, I forced myself to sit back down, keeping the shotgun within reach. Sleep never came easy that night. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something. A branch snapping, leaves rustling, the wind shifting just enough to make me sit up, pulse racing. By the time the first light crept through the trees, I was already up, stuffing my things back into my bag. I had planned to stay the whole week, clean up the cabin, maybe even do some hunting. But my gut told me to leave, and I wasn't about to ignore it. I stepped onto the porch, ready to load my things into the truck, then stopped cold. In the dirt just below the front step were footprints.
Bora.
Human. They led from the woods to the porch, but none led away. I left everything behind, just grabbed my keys, jumped into the truck, and didn't look back. The drive home felt longer than it should have. My hands didn't stop shaking until I was miles away, back in the safety of streetlights and passing cars. I never went back to that cabin, never even considered it. A few months later, I got a call from a man who had been hiking in the area. He'd found the place abandoned, my uncle's old truck still sitting out front. He asked if I wanted to sell it, said he was looking for a quiet place to settle down. I told him he could have it, for free, and I hung up before he could ask why, because I already knew the answer. Some things aren't meant to be disturbed. Some places, once you leave, you don't go back, and I wasn't about to find out why. It was late October when I was assigned to border duty in a remote part of Montana. The terrain was harsh, endless pine forests, rocky hills, and winding dirt roads that stretched for miles. This section of the border wasn't particularly active, but it needed eyes on it. Most of my time would be spent in a small cabin, built decades ago as a station for officers like me. The cabin sat near the edge of a valley, hidden in the thick trees. It was old, built from rough-cut logs, with a slanted roof and a small chimney that didn't seem like it had been used in years. A single room inside, no running water, just a cot, a wood-burning stove, and a shortwave radio for check-ins. I had a truck parked outside, but cell service was non-existent. I was to stay for 10 days, alone, monitoring the area for any suspicious movement. Supplies were dropped off once a week, and I had a rifle, a sidearm, and enough canned food to last. The job was simple: watch, report, and deter. On the first night, the silence hit me. No distant traffic, no hum of power lines, just the wind cutting through the trees. I kept a lantern lit inside, reading reports from previous officers. Most were uneventful. Occasional animal sightings. 1 or 2 mentions of footprints found near the cabin, but nothing serious. I woke up just before dawn, a strange feeling settling over me. At first, I thought it was just the cold creeping in, but something felt off. I stepped outside, my breath hanging in the air. The truck was fine. The cabin looked the same, but there was something subtle, like the trees had shifted, like the ground had been disturbed. Couldn't place it. Day after day, I patrolled the area, hiking the trails near the cabin, watching from the small lookout post further up the hill. Most nights were uneventful, but every so often, I'd hear something. Distant snapping twigs, the crunch of leaves. Probably animals, I told myself, but it didn't sit right. On the fourth night, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. Slow footsteps, not the scurry of a small animal, something bigger. I sat up, grabbing my rifle, straining to listen. The footsteps circled the cabin. One pass, then another. I moved toward the window, but all I could see was darkness. I stayed awake until dawn, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did, but when I stepped outside, I saw them, footprints. They weren't mine. Bare feet, deep in the mud, circling the cabin twice before vanishing into the trees. I reported it on the radio. The response was what I expected. Asterisk could be an animal, could be nothing. Keep watch. Asterisk, I wasn't convinced. The next day, I checked the area more thoroughly. The ground was firm in most places, except near the cabin where the rain had softened it. The prints were fresh, meaning someone or something had been walking barefoot in the freezing cold. That night, I locked the door, checked my rifle, and kept the lantern burning low. I listened. For hours, nothing. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard it again. A deep, slow creak. The porch. Someone was on the porch. I raised the rifle, heart pounding. The wood groaned again, slow and deliberate. I could feel the presence on the other side of the wall. I waited. The door never moved. No attempt to force it open. Then silence. Minutes passed. Then hours. The first light of dawn broke through the trees, and I stepped outside, gun raised. No one there, but the footprints were. This time, leading away from the porch, back into the trees. I followed. The prints led about 30 yards into the woods before vanishing. No other signs of movement.
No disturbed branches.
Just a dead stop, like whoever made them had simply disappeared. I patrolled further out that day, my nerves stretched thin. I had a week left. I considered calling in for an early pickup, but something in me didn't want to leave it unresolved. That night, I built a fire outside. If something was out there, I wanted it to know I was ready. The flames crackled, sending shadows flickering across the trees. I sat with my rifle across my lap, waiting. The night stretched on. No movement.
No sounds.
Maybe it was over. I was wrong. Somewhere past midnight, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees. Too far to make out details, but close enough that I could see it wasn't an animal. It didn't move, didn't shift or sway like a person naturally would. It just stood still as stone. I raised my rifle, my pulse hammering in my ears. I should have called out, but something about the way it stood there made my throat close. Minutes passed. Then slowly it turned. Not walking away, just turning, as if it wanted me to see the motion. Then it stepped back into the trees, vanishing into the dark. I didn't sleep. By morning, I made a decision. I was done playing whatever game this was. I packed my things, loaded my rifle, and prepared to leave early. Then I saw them. Footprints circling the cabin. Not just once or twice, but over and over, dozens of overlapping tracks. It had been there all night. I left, driving down that dirt road. My hands gripped the wheel tight enough to turn my knuckles white. I didn't stop until I reached the main station, miles away. I told them everything, showed them the photos I took of the prints. The response was simple, "We'll check it out." I never heard back. A week later, another officer took over the post. I never asked him about it. Never wanted to know. Whatever was out there, it wasn't my problem anymore. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about it. The way it just stood there, watching. And I wonder if somewhere deep in those woods, It still is. I wasn't planning to spend the night out there. It was supposed to be a quick drive up to check on the cabin, make sure everything was still in place for the season. The last time I'd been there was early fall, and now that winter was creeping in, I wanted to be sure nothing had been damaged by the first waves of bad weather. The cabin had been in my family for years, built decades ago when my grandfather worked in logging. It sat far off the main roads, past winding dirt trails that used to be logging routes, now overgrown and barely navigable. It had no electricity, no running water, just a wood stove and an old hand-pumped well outside. I liked that about it. I liked the isolation, but I never stayed alone overnight. It was late November, and the sun was already dipping below the tree line by the time I arrived. I should have left earlier. The days were getting shorter, and I knew better than to be out here alone at night. But I told myself I'd just check inside, make sure no animals had gotten in, and be back on the road before it got too dark. When I pulled up, the first thing I noticed was how silent it was. The woods had a way of swallowing sound, but this was different. Usually, I'd hear birds, maybe the distant rustle of deer moving through the trees. That evening, there was nothing, just the sound of my own boots crunching on the frozen ground. The cabin looked fine from the outside. The wooden walls were still solid. The roof was intact, no sign of damage from the wind or rain. But as I got closer, I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. The padlock on the front door was gone. I knew for a fact I had locked it the last time I was here. The metal latch was still hanging in place, but the lock itself was missing. Not broken, not cut, just gone. I stood there for a long moment, my breath clouding in the cold air. There weren't many people who even knew this place existed. The nearest town was over 20 miles away, and the roads leading up here weren't exactly easy to find. But someone had been here. I told myself it was probably some hunter, maybe someone looking for shelter from the cold. But as I pushed the door open, I realized that wasn't it. Inside, nothing looked obviously disturbed. The old wooden table was still in the center of the room, the chairs pushed in like I'd left them. The cot against the far wall still had its thin blanket folded on top. But the air inside was different, stale, like it had been closed up for too long. Then I saw the footprints. They were faint, just traces of dirt on the wooden floorboards, but they were there. A few near the door, a few leading toward the cot. They weren't mine. I felt my pulse in my ears, my skin crawling under my jacket. Someone had been inside. I turned back toward the door, ready to leave, but then I saw something that made my stomach drop. The footprints. There was only one set. Whoever had been in here hadn't left. My breathing slowed, my body frozen in place. I scanned the room again, my eyes darting to every dark corner, every shadowed space. The cabin wasn't big. One room, a small storage space in the back, nowhere to really hide. But I hadn't checked the storage room yet. I forced myself to move, each step feeling heavier than the last. The storage room door was closed, just like I had left it months ago. But I noticed something now that I hadn't before. The doorknob was clean, too clean. The rest of the cabin had a fine layer of dust over everything. But the doorknob? It looked like it had been wiped down. I swallowed hard. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get in my truck and never look back. But I had to know. I reached out, gripping the knob. The door wasn't locked. Creaked open an inch, then two. The room was dark. Too dark. I reached for my flashlight, flicking it on, the beam cutting through the blackness. And that's when I saw it. A sleeping bag, laid out neatly in the middle of the floor. A few empty food wrappers next to it. A half-full water bottle. Someone had been living here. Recently. My brain tried to make sense of it. Had they left? Were they still here, hiding somewhere outside? Or worse, a sound. It wasn't loud, just the faintest creak of a floorboard behind me. I turned fast, the flashlight beam shaking. Nothing. The main room looked exactly the same as before. The door was still open. The night beyond it was dark. Too dark. I backed up, my breath coming fast. My truck was outside. If I moved fast, I could be in it in seconds. But that meant turning my back. I took a slow step forward, then another. I felt exposed, like something was watching me, just out of sight. I forced myself to move faster, reaching the doorway. The cold air hit my face like a slap. Then I heard it, a breath, right behind me. I ran. I don't remember getting to the truck. I don't remember fumbling with the keys, yanking the door open, slamming it shut behind me. But suddenly, I was inside, my hands shaking as I jammed the key into the ignition. The headlights flicked on, illuminating the front of the cabin. And that's when I saw him, a man standing just inside the doorway, motionless, watching me. He wasn't hiding, he wasn't running, just standing there, half hidden in the shadows of the cabin, his face blank. I hit the gas. The tires spun on the frozen dirt before catching, and then I was flying down the narrow path, branches scraping against the truck. I didn't look back. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main road, miles away. My hands were still shaking, my pulse hammering in my ears. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who he was. I don't know how long he had been there, but he knew I was coming, and he was waiting. I remember the first time I met Thomas, my business partner. We had started a contracting company together 5 years ago, building and renovating cabins in remote areas. It was good work and we made a decent living. But there was one job that neither of us ever spoke about again. It happened in the fall of 2017. A client had hired us to rebuild an old hunting cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana. The place was falling apart. Years of neglect had left it barely standing. The roof sagged, the walls were splitting, and the foundation was unstable. It was the kind of job that would take months, but the client wanted it done as quickly as possible. They were paying well, so we took it. The location was a problem. The nearest town was over an hour away by truck, and the last 10 miles were on an old logging road that had been mostly reclaimed by nature. The thick forest pressed in from both sides, and fallen branches littered the path. It was clear no one had been out there in a long time. We arrived early in the morning, our truck loaded with supplies. The air was crisp, and the scent of damp earth filled my lungs. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines. It was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of the wind moving through the trees. Thomas and I got to work immediately, assessing the damage. The walls were worse than we thought. Some of the beams had rotted clean through. The front porch was barely holding on, and the interior was littered with debris. It was going to be a long job. The first few days went by without anything unusual. We worked from sunrise to sunset, cutting wood, replacing beams, and reinforcing the structure. The days were long and exhausting, but that was part of the job. Then, on the 4th day, things started feeling off. It started with small things. Tools went missing only to turn up in strange places. A hammer I had left on the workbench was suddenly outside, sitting on a tree stump. A bundle of nails disappeared from the supply pile, and we found them scattered across the floor inside the cabin. At first, we laughed it off, blaming exhaustion or forgetfulness. But then, at night, we heard something moving outside. It was just footsteps at first. Slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. We thought it might have been an animal, a deer, maybe, or a coyote. But animals don't walk in circles around a cabin for hours. The second night, I woke up to the sound of twigs snapping right outside my tent. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it through the thin fabric, but I couldn't see anything. When I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the forest was empty. Thomas was already awake, standing near the fire with a tight grip on his hatchet. Neither of us said anything. We just stood there for a while, listening. The woods were still, too still. The next morning, we found footprints in the dirt near our tents. Human footprints. They weren't ours. We had been wearing thick work boots, but these prints were different. The soles were flat, like someone had been walking barefoot in the woods. They circled our tents and led back toward the trees. We considered packing up and leaving, but the job was too important. The client had paid us half up front, and we had already invested time and effort into the work. So we stayed. That was a mistake. On the 6th day, while we were replacing part of the roof, we heard something in the woods. It was distant at first, a faint rustling sound, but it got closer. Branches cracked, and the underbrush shifted. Thomas and I stopped working and listened. Then we saw him. A man stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden behind a tree. He was watching us. He was thin, almost skeletal, with dirty clothes that hung loose on his frame. His face was obscured by the shadows, but I could feel his eyes on us. We called out to him, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, motionless. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he stepped back into the trees and was gone. That night, we barely slept. We kept the fire going and took turns keeping watch. Every so often, we heard noises in the distance. Footsteps, snapping branches, rustling leaves. But we never saw him again. The next day, we made the decision to leave. We packed our things, locked up our tools in the cabin, and started down the logging road. About 2 miles from the site, we found something that made my stomach drop. A dead deer was lying in the middle of the path. Its throat had been slit, and its eyes were missing. We didn't stop. We didn't talk. We just kept driving. When we got back to town, we called the client and told them we wouldn't be finishing the job. They weren't happy, but we didn't care. We never went back. A month later, I looked up the property online. It was still abandoned. No one had moved in. No one had finished the renovations. And no one ever found out who that man was. I don't know why I said yes. Maybe it was the money. Maybe I just wanted some time alone. Or maybe I was just too stupid to say no. Either way, when my uncle asked if I could look after the old cabin by the graveyard for a couple of weeks while he was out of town, I agreed without thinking too hard about it. The cabin wasn't anything special, just a small wooden house on the edge of an old cemetery outside of town. My uncle had bought the land years ago, planning to fix the place up and maybe rent it out, but nothing ever came of it. He lived there sometimes when he needed a break from the city, but most of the time, the cabin just sat there, empty, forgotten, surrounded by tombstones and silence. I drove up there on a cold evening, the sun already dipping below the horizon by the time I turned onto the narrow dirt road leading to the cabin. It was the kind of place that felt isolated even when you knew civilization wasn't that far away. The trees lining the road were tall and dark, their bare branches stretching out like skeletal fingers. The wind had picked up, rustling the dead leaves scattered across the ground, and for a moment, I wondered if I had made a mistake coming here alone. But it was too late to turn back now. The cabin itself was just as I remembered, small, weathered, with a sagging roof and a porch that creaked under my weight as I stepped onto it. The cemetery stretched out behind it, a field of old, forgotten graves hidden between the trees. Some of the headstones were so worn down you could barely read the names anymore. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with the scent of old wood and dust. I flicked on the lights, half expecting them not to work, but the single bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered to life, casting long shadows against the walls. The cabin had only the bare necessities: a small kitchen, a worn-out couch, a wood stove, and a single bedroom with a lumpy mattress. I set my bags down, took a deep breath, and told myself it was just a couple of weeks. That first night, I didn't sleep well. The bed was uncomfortable, and the wind outside never seemed to stop. I could hear it howling through the trees, rattling the windows, making the whole cabin creak like an old ship in a storm. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped, then another. I told myself it was just the wind, that it was nothing to worry about, but I still found myself staring at the ceiling, listening, waiting. At some point, I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to silence. The wind had stopped, the cabin was still, and everything felt wrong, like the world had been put on pause. I rolled over and glanced at the clock. 3:17 a.m., and then I heard it, a sound from outside, a slow, deliberate crunching of leaves. I held my breath, heart hammering. It was probably an animal, a deer maybe, or a fox, but it didn't move like an animal. The footsteps were too heavy, too slow, like someone was walking carefully, deliberately. I sat up, straining to hear. The sound stopped. I waited, counting the seconds in my head, but everything stayed quiet. After a while, I convinced myself I had imagined it and forced myself to lie back down. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next few days were uneventful. I spent most of my time chopping firewood, cleaning up the cabin, and trying not to think too much about the cemetery behind me. During the day, it wasn't so bad. The sun made the headstones look less ominous, and the silence felt peaceful rather than unsettling. But at night, the feeling changed. Every evening, as the sun set, the cabin started to feel smaller, the walls pressing in around me. The darkness outside felt heavier, thicker, and every night, around the same time, I would hear those same slow, careful footsteps outside. I never saw anything, never found any tracks in the dirt, but I knew something or someone was out there. One night, I decided to check. I waited until I heard the footsteps, then grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen and stepped onto the porch. The air was cold, my breath fogging in front of me. The trees swayed in the wind, their branches casting long, shifting shadows. I swept the flashlight across the yard, the beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. The cemetery was silent, the graves untouched. The dirt road leading up to the cabin was empty, but I still felt it, that feeling of being watched. I went back inside, locked the door, and didn't step outside again until morning. A week passed, and I started to think maybe I had just been paranoid. The mind plays tricks on you when you're alone in a place like this. But then I found something that changed everything. I was walking along the edge of the cemetery, not too far from the cabin, when I noticed something half buried in the dirt. At first, I thought it was just a piece of old wood, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else. A boot, a single, weathered boot, covered in dirt and leaves. And next to it, the ground had been disturbed, like something had been dug up or buried there recently. A chill ran down my spine. I crouched down, brushing away some of the loose dirt, and my stomach twisted when I saw what was underneath. Bone, not animal, human. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps. My first instinct was to run, to get in my truck and drive away, but I forced myself to think. Someone had been here. Someone had buried something or someone near the cabin, and whoever they were, they might still be watching. I couldn't stay there anymore. I spent the rest of the day packing my things, barely eating, barely thinking about anything except getting out. I decided I'd leave first thing in the morning when there was enough light to see the road clearly. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow looked like something lurking just outside the window. And then, Just after midnight, the footsteps came back. But this time, they didn't stop outside. This time, they came up the porch steps. I held my breath, gripping the knife I had taken from the kitchen. The footsteps paused at the door. The handle rattled. Then silence. I sat there in the dark, my heart pounding, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Minutes passed. An hour. Nothing. By the time the sun started to rise, I was still sitting there, wide awake, my body stiff with fear. When I finally got the courage to open the door, the porch was empty. But there, on the wooden boards, was a single boot print. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my bags, threw them in the truck, and left without looking back. I never told my uncle what I found. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want to know. A few months later, I heard that the land had been sold. Someone else owned the cabin now. I never went back. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone, I still hear those footsteps in my head. And I wonder if whoever or whatever was out there is still watching. I had always liked being alone in the woods. There was something about the quiet, the stillness, the way the trees swallowed sound. It made me feel like I had control over my own little world. I had been working as a wildlife surveyor for a few years, which meant I spent a lot of time in remote places, away from people, away from the city, just me and the land. This time, I was sent out to a stretch of forest in northern Montana. It was early October, cold enough to make my breath show in the mornings, but not yet freezing. My job was simple: track animal activity, record any unusual patterns, and check the health of the ecosystem. The company provided me with an old cabin deep in the woods, about 20 miles from the nearest town. It was the kind of place that felt forgotten, sitting on the edge of an old logging road that probably hadn't seen a truck in years. The cabin was basic: a single room, a wood-burning stove, a small cot, and a table. No electricity, no plumbing. I had a propane lantern, a few weeks' worth of canned food, and a rifle in case I ran into any predators. The first few days were peaceful. I followed tracks in the dirt, set up motion-activated cameras, and spent long hours hiking through the trees. The forest was alive with the usual sounds: birds, the rustling of small animals, the occasional distant howl of a coyote. But as the days passed, I started noticing things that didn't sit right with me. First, it was small. I'd find animal tracks that seemed off, like a deer's but wrong, too long, too narrow. The spacing between the prints was strange, as if whatever had made them was walking on 2 legs instead of 4. One evening, I found a dead deer not far from my cabin. Something had torn into it, but not in the way a predator usually would. The cuts were too clean, too precise, as if made by a blade rather than teeth or claws. The head was missing entirely. That night, I locked my cabin door for the first time. I wasn't sure why. I had spent years out in the wild, surrounded by animals that could tear me apart, but this felt different. It wasn't just the idea of a predator. It was the way the air felt, heavy and wrong, like the woods themselves were watching me. Then the noises started. It was late, maybe 2 or 3 in the morning, when I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. It was slow, deliberate, heavy, not the quick, darting steps of a fox or the cautious tread of a bear. It sounded like someone was walking around the cabin. I reached for my rifle and sat up in bed, listening. The footsteps circled the cabin once, twice, then stopped right outside my door. I held my breath. Silence. Then something tapped against the wood. Not a knock, a tap, like the sound of fingers drumming against a table. It moved from the door to the window, then back again, slow, methodical. I didn't move. The tapping stopped. Then a voice. It sounded wrong, too flat, too careful, like someone who had never spoken before trying to mimic human speech. "Let me in." My stomach turned to ice. I gripped my rifle tighter, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might shake the walls. The voice called out again, then again. Each time it sounded a little different, like it was testing different tones, different pitches. Then it stopped. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By morning, I found deep scratches on the cabin door. The ground outside was disturbed, covered in footprints that didn't match anything I had ever seen before. They were human-shaped, but the toes were too long, the arch too high. I should have left then, packed up my gear, hiked back to my truck, and never looked back. But I didn't. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was tired, that maybe I had just dreamed the whole thing. The next night, it came back. This time, it didn't just tap on the walls. It whispered my name, over and over and over. The same flat, unnatural voice. I didn't answer. I didn't move. Then the voice changed. Sounded like my own. I don't remember falling asleep. I only remember waking up to the sound of my own voice, right outside the window, calling me. The next morning, I made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my gear, grabbed my rifle, and started the long hike back to my truck. The forest was silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. Halfway to my truck, I saw something ahead of me. First, I thought it was a man. He was tall, wearing clothes that looked old, faded, like they had been left out in the sun for too long. His skin was pale, stretched too tight over his bones. His eyes were wrong, too wide, too dark, like deep pits in his skull. Then he smiled. It wasn't a human smile. It was too broad, too forced, like he was still figuring out how mouths worked. Then he took a step toward me. I raised my rifle, but before I could fire, he moved. Not ran, moved. 1 second he was 20 feet away, the next he was 5. I fired. The sound echoed through the trees, but he didn't fall. He didn't even flinch. He just tilted his head, like he was curious. Then he opened his mouth, not to speak, to scream. The sound didn't make sense. It wasn't human, it wasn't animal, it wasn't anything I had ever heard before. It rattled through my bones, made my skin crawl, made every instinct in my body scream at me to run. So I did. I didn't stop, not when my legs burned, not when my lungs begged for air. I ran until I saw my truck, until I threw open the door, until I peeled out onto the dirt road without looking back. I didn't stop until I reached town. I didn't tell anyone what happened. What would I even say? That something in the woods had worn my voice, my face, that it had smiled at me like it knew me? I quit my job the next day, moved to a city, far from the forests, far from the quiet. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is still, I hear it. A voice, flat and careful, calling my name. It was a cold October night when I found myself deep in the countryside of Northumberland, surrounded by dense woodland and endless silence. The air smelled of damp earth, and the wind carried the scent of pine. I had come to stay in a remote cabin for a week, hoping to get away from the noise of the city. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a time to clear my mind and be alone with nature. The cabin itself was old but sturdy, made from thick logs that had darkened over time. The roof sagged slightly, and the front porch creaked when I stepped onto it. There was no electricity, only an old fireplace and a few oil lamps to light the rooms. It had everything I needed: a small kitchen, a bedroom, a bathroom with an old-fashioned water pump, and a living area with a single worn-out armchair. The silence was both comforting and unsettling. I told myself I needed this break. The first few nights passed without much event. I spent my days walking through the forest, listening to the rustling leaves and the distant sound of birds. The evenings were spent by the fire, reading an old book I had brought with me. The isolation was exactly what I had wanted until the fourth night. That evening, the weather changed. The wind picked up, rattling the cabin's windows, and a fine mist began to roll in through the trees. It was colder than the previous nights, and the fire struggled to keep the room warm. As I sat in the armchair, staring into the flames, I felt an odd sense of unease creeping up my spine. It was that strange feeling of being watched, though I knew I was alone. I shook it off and decided to go outside for some fresh air. Stepping onto the porch, I pulled my jacket tighter around me and looked out into the darkness. The trees swayed in the wind, their silhouettes stretching and shifting under the moonlight. Then something caught my eye. A figure stood at the tree line. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the branches moving in the wind. But as I focused, I saw her, a woman. She was standing completely still, her body half hidden behind a tree. She was too far away for me to see her face clearly, but I could make out the long, pale dress she was wearing. It looked old, as though it belonged to another time. Her hair was dark, hanging loose around her shoulders. The way she stood, motionless, made my stomach tighten. I turned back toward the cabin, my heart beginning to beat faster. I told myself she was just someone from a nearby farmhouse, maybe a lost hiker. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. No one wandered around in the middle of the woods at night, not in weather like this. I stepped inside and locked the door behind me. My hands were shaking. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself I was being paranoid. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I checked the windows, pulling the curtains shut, though I still had the overwhelming sensation that I was being watched. I barely slept that night. Every little noise outside made me tense up. The wind howled against the cabin, the trees groaned, and once or twice, I swore I heard faint footsteps crunching against the dead leaves. By morning, the woman was gone. I forced myself to believe it had been my imagination. The stress of isolation, the way the forest played tricks on the mind. But that evening, just as the sun dipped below the trees, I saw her again. She was closer this time, standing just beyond the clearing, only a few meters from the cabin. She hadn't moved all day. I would have seen her, but now there she was, standing in the exact same stillness as before. I felt my throat tighten. Every instinct in me screamed to leave, to get away from that place. But the car was a 15-minute walk through the woods, and the last thing I wanted to do was run through the darkness with her out there. I forced myself to stay inside, bolting the door and closing every curtain. My breathing was shallow as I sat on the bed, trying to figure out what to do. I could leave at first light, head back to the city, and never look back. That night, the sounds outside were worse. The wind had died down, and instead of howling, there was silence, except for the unmistakable sound of footsteps circling the cabin. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath, my body frozen in place. The floorboards creaked outside the door, as though someone had stepped onto the porch. I wanted to look. I wanted to see if she was there, but something told me that if I did, if I so much as peeked through the curtain, I wouldn't like what I saw. I sat there for what felt like hours, gripping the handle of a knife I had found in the kitchen drawer. The footsteps stopped eventually, but I didn't sleep. I sat awake until the first light of morning filtered through the curtains. As soon as the sun was up, I packed my bag. I didn't bother cleaning up, didn't care about anything other than getting to my car. When I stepped onto the porch, my stomach dropped. There were footprints in the dirt, small, barefoot impressions circling the cabin. I didn't look back. I walked quickly but carefully down the path, every nerve in my body on edge. The forest felt different that morning, too quiet, as if it was holding its breath. When I reached my car, I threw my bag in and got inside, locking the doors before I even turned the key. The engine roared to life, and I pulled onto the narrow dirt road, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't slow down. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I just drove, It wasn't until I was miles away, back on the main road, that I finally let out a breath. I never went back to that cabin. I never found out who she was or what she wanted. But sometimes, even now, I still wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced that if I look out my window, I'll see her standing there, watching, waiting. I had been planning this for months, and I wasn't going to let a little bad weather stop me. That's what I kept telling myself as I drove deeper into the woods, my truck bouncing along the narrow dirt road, the rain hammering against the windshield. The wipers struggled to keep up, smearing the water across the glass, making it hard to see. The headlights barely cut through the downpour, but I knew the way well enough. I had bought this patch of land a year ago, 10 acres of thick forest, mostly pines and oaks, with no neighbors for miles. It was what I wanted, a place to be alone, to build something with my own hands, and to get away from the constant noise of town. I had a house back in the city, but I didn't want to live there anymore. I needed this. The plan was simple: build a small cabin from the ground up. I had spent the last few weekends clearing the area, laying the foundation, and cutting lumber. The walls were already up, and tonight, I just had to finish the roof. I had planned to do it earlier in the day, but work had kept me late, and by the time I loaded up my truck with the last batch of supplies, the sky had already turned dark. The rain had started just as I hit the road out of town, and by the time I reached my land, it had become a full storm. The air was thick and cold, the smell of wet earth and pine filling my lungs as I stepped out of the truck. The ground was already turning soft, my boots sinking slightly in the mud. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the cabin. It wasn't much yet, just a single room with 4 walls and an unfinished roof, but it was getting there. I had set up a tarp over the top to keep the inside dry, but the wind had torn part of it loose. It flapped wildly in the wind, the rain making it snap like a whip. I sighed, pulled my hood tighter around my face, and grabbed my tool bag. I had a job to finish. The wind howled through the trees as I climbed the ladder to the roof, my hands slick with rain as I gripped the wooden beams. I had left a stack of planks up here last time, and I carefully positioned myself on the framework, bracing my legs to keep from slipping. The rain made everything difficult. My hammer was slippery in my grip, the nails kept skidding out of place, and every time I adjusted my position, the wet would threaten to send me sliding off the edge. I focused on the work, forcing myself to ignore the storm around me. One nail at a time, one board at a time. But then, something made me stop. It was a sound low, distant, but distinct. It wasn't the rain, wasn't the wind, wasn't the creaking of the trees. It was something else. I froze, gripping the beam tightly, my breath coming out in short, misty puffs. I turned my head slowly, my flashlight beam sweeping over the trees. The rain made it hard to see, turning everything into a blur of shadows and moving branches. But I didn't see anything out of place. Still, the feeling in my gut told me something was off. I stayed like that for a while, crouched on the unfinished roof, listening, waiting. But nothing happened. The rain kept falling, the wind kept blowing, and I told myself I was being paranoid. I was alone out here. I had made sure of that. I shook it off and went back to work. Took me longer than I planned, but I got the last of the planks nailed down. The cabin was sealed now, at least enough to keep the rain out. My back ached, my hands were raw, and my clothes were soaked through, but it was done. I climbed down carefully, my boots hitting the wet ground with a squelch. The rain had turned the dirt to mud, and I had to watch my step as I made my way to the truck. That's when I noticed something. Footprints, not mine. I stopped, my heart hammering against my ribs. The flashlight beam shook slightly as I moved it over the ground. The prints were fresh, just a few feet from the cabin. They weren't deep. Whoever made them had been light on their feet, but they were there, and they weren't heading toward the cabin. They were heading away. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry despite the rain. My first thought was that maybe I had made them earlier without realizing it. But I knew that wasn't true. These prints hadn't been here when I arrived. I would have noticed them. I turned, slowly sweeping my flashlight over the woods. The trees swayed in the wind, their branches creaking and groaning, but nothing moved beyond that. But someone had been here, and they had left. I told myself it could have been a hiker, maybe a hunter passing through. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. No one had any reason to be out here, especially not in this weather, and definitely not this close to my cabin. The feeling in my gut got worse. I forced myself to move, heading toward the truck, my boots sliding in the mud. I threw my tools in the back, keeping my flashlight trained on the woods. The rain was still coming down hard, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I got in the truck, locked the doors, and sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel. The footprints were still fresh, which meant whoever made them had been here recently. Maybe while I was on the roof, maybe even closer than I realized. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine rumbling to life. The headlights cut through the rain, illuminating the trees. Nothing moved. I put the truck in gear and started backing up, my tires struggling in the mud. My eyes stayed on the rearview mirror, scanning the darkness behind me. Then, just before I turned onto the road, I saw it, a figure, standing just at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the rain. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching. I didn't wait to see what they would do. I hit the gas, my tires spinning before catching, and sped down the dirt road. I didn't stop, didn't slow down until I was miles away. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, when the storm had passed, I went back. The footprints were still there, but they had been washed out by the rain. I searched the woods, checking every inch of my land. I didn't find anyone, but I knew what I saw. I finished the cabin over the next few weeks, but I never stayed there overnight. Not after that, because someone had been out there, and whoever they were, they had been watching me, waiting, and I wasn't going to wait around to find out why. I wasn't supposed to inherit anything. My grandfather had been a stubborn man, not one for generosity, and he and I had never been particularly close. I saw him a few times growing up, usually at family gatherings, where he sat quietly in the corner, sipping whiskey with a distant look in his eyes. He was never unkind, but he was never warm either. So when the lawyer called me after his passing and told me that he'd left me a property, a cabin of all things, I was confused. More than that, I was suspicious. Why would he leave me something like that? My father, his only son, was just as confused. He had assumed he'd be the one to get whatever my grandfather had left behind. Instead, it had gone to me. The lawyer didn't have many details, just an address, a set of keys, and a brief mention that the place had belonged to my grandfather's ex-wife. I hadn't even known he'd been married before he met my grandmother. No one in my family talked about it. I figured it must have been a part of his life he wanted to forget, but for some reason, he had still held on to the property all these years. I wasn't really interested in keeping it. I had no need for a cabin, especially not one in the middle of nowhere. But I figured I'd drive out there, check it out, and see if I could sell it. Maybe it was worth something. The cabin was in a remote valley, deep in the mountains. I had never been to that part of the country before, and the drive took me through winding roads that seemed to stretch endlessly into thick forests. The further I drove, the fewer signs of civilization I saw. Towns became villages, villages became scattered farmhouses, and soon there was nothing but trees on either side of the road. My phone lost service hours before I even got close. I wasn't too worried about that, but it was unsettling knowing I couldn't call anyone if something went wrong. I had brought supplies, food, water, a flashlight, a knife, just in case, but I still felt uneasy. The last stretch of road was barely a road at all. It was more of a dirt path, overgrown with weeds and scattered with rocks. My car struggled up the incline, tires spinning in the loose gravel. When I finally saw the cabin, I wasn't relieved. If anything, I felt worse. It was an old place, small, made of dark, weathered wood. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the front porch looked like it was one bad storm away from collapsing. The windows were dusty, the curtains inside drawn tight. There was no sign that anyone had been there in years. I parked and sat in the car for a moment, gripping the wheel. Something about the place felt off. Not haunted, just wrong. But I wasn't going to drive all this way just to turn around. Inside, it was exactly what I expected. Dust, cobwebs, the faint smell of old wood and mildew. The furniture was sparse, mostly just a table, a few chairs, and a couch that looked like it had been sitting there since the 70s. There was a small kitchen, a single bedroom, and a bathroom that barely qualified as one. I checked the cabinets, found some old canned goods that had rusted over. In the bedroom, the bed was still made, the sheets stiff with age. It was like someone had walked out one day and never come back. I wasn't planning on staying long. I just needed to take some pictures, get an idea of what needed to be fixed, and then I'd be on my way. But as I walked through the cabin, something caught my eye. An old journal, sitting on the table, covered in dust. I brushed it off and flipped through it. The handwriting was neat, feminine. It had to belong to my grandfather's ex-wife. The entries were mostly mundane. Notes about the weather, about tending to a small garden behind the cabin, about waiting for my grandfather to visit. But then, as I flipped further in, the tone changed. The entries became frantic. She wrote about noises outside at night, about finding footprints that weren't hers in the dirt, about waking up to the sound of something scratching at the windows. She wrote about seeing something in the trees. I stopped reading. The hair on my arms stood up. It was just paranoia, I told myself. Being alone in a place like this could mess with your head. I put the journal down. I took a few more pictures and decided to leave. But then I noticed something. The footprints outside the cabin. They weren't mine. I should have left. I should have gotten in my car and driven away. But I told myself I was being stupid. The footprints could have been old. Maybe from a hunter or some lost hiker. Still, I locked the door that night. I tried to sleep, but every sound made me jump. The wind in the trees, the creak of the old wood, the rustling of leaves outside. I told myself it was nothing. Then, in the middle of the night, I heard it. A slow, deliberate knock on the door. I didn't move. Another knock, and then a scratch, right against the wood. I lay there, barely breathing. The scratching moved, up along the door, then across the window. Something was outside. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it at the window. For a split second, I saw something. A face just barely visible through the glass. Eyes reflecting the light. A shape too tall, too thin. And then it was gone. I didn't sleep. I sat there with my flashlight, gripping the knife I had brought. The noises continued for hours. Scratching, footsteps, something brushing against the walls of the cabin. By dawn, it had stopped. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my bag, threw open the door, and sprinted to my car. But when I got there, my tires were slashed. I didn't look back. I just ran. Down the dirt road, through the trees, running until my legs felt like they were going to give out. I had no phone, no way to call for help. It took me hours, but I finally reached a main road. A trucker picked me up, asked me what had happened. I told him I'd gotten lost, that my car had broken down. I never went back to the cabin. I didn't tell my family what happened. I just told them it wasn't worth keeping, that they should sell it. But I never told them the truth, that whatever had been out there watching me, waiting outside that cabin, it wasn't human, and it was still out there. I never wanted the cabin. When my uncle passed away in 2014, he left me the small, rundown place out in the Pecos wilderness of New Mexico. I hadn't been there since I was a kid, but I remembered it well. The one-room structure sat in a narrow canon, hidden from the main road by a long dirt trail that could barely be called a driveway. It had no electricity, no running water, and a rusted wood stove for heat. I had no use for it, but I held on to it anyway. Maybe it was sentimentality, or maybe I just didn't want to deal with selling it. Either way, the cabin stayed in my name, untouched for nearly 10 years, until I finally found a reason to go back. That winter, I needed a place to get away. Life had been falling apart at the seams. Work stress, a breakup, the weight of everything I'd been putting off. I convinced myself that a weekend in the mountains would help clear my head. So, on a cold Friday in February, I drove out of Santa Fe and into the mountains. The higher I climbed, the more the roads twisted. The more snow clung to the edges of the forest, turning the earth into a mix of dead grass, pine needles, and ice. By the time I reached the dirt road that led to the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the peaks. Shadows stretched long across the trees as I turned onto the trail. My truck bounced over frozen ruts, the tires kicking up dry snow. The cabin was exactly as I remembered. Weathered gray wood, a sagging roof, the door still marked with my uncle's old initials carved into the frame. Inside, the air was stale. Dust covered every surface, and rodent droppings littered the corners. I started a fire in the wood stove, set up my sleeping bag on the cot, and sat down at the old wooden table with a bottle of whiskey. It should have felt peaceful. Didn't. The silence pressed down, thick and heavy, broken only by the crackling fire and the wind outside. I told myself I was just out of my element. I wasn't used to being this deep in the woods alone. But as the night dragged on, that uneasy feeling didn't go away. It got worse. I woke up to a sound. It was faint, just a light tap, tap, tap against the side of the cabin. I lay still, listening, my breath fogging in the cold air. Wind, I told myself. Just the wind. The tapping came again. It wasn't the wind. I sat up slowly, reaching for the flashlight beside me. The fire in the stove had burned low, casting the cabin in deep shadows. I flicked on the light and aimed it at the nearest window. The glass reflected the room back at me. Dusty shelves, the edge of the cot, my own face half lit in the glow. Beyond that, nothing but darkness. I held my breath, waiting. The tapping stopped. I didn't sleep much after that. Morning came gray and cold. I stepped outside to find fresh snow had fallen overnight, blanketing the ground in a thin layer of white. That's when I saw them, tracks, leading from the trees to the cabin. They weren't animal prints. They were boot prints. Someone had been out there, watching. I spent the day trying to shake the feeling of being watched, but the tension never left my chest. I checked my truck, making sure it would start if I needed to leave in a hurry. I made a fire early, keeping the cabin warm as the sun dipped below the ridge again. That night, I locked the door. I wedged a chair under the handle. I kept my knife within reach. It didn't matter. The tapping came back.
Asterisk top, 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 asterisk slow.
Deliberate. I held my breath, gripping the knife tight. My ears strained against the silence, waiting. The sound came from the back of the cabin this time, then from the side, then tap, tap, tap. Right outside the door. I stayed frozen, barely daring to breathe. The handle rattled. Someone was out there. I didn't move. Didn't make a sound. The rattling stopped. Then crunch, footsteps, heavy ones, circling the cabin. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay still. My heart pounded in my chest, every muscle in my body tight as a wire. The footsteps stopped. The silence stretched long. Then nothing. I waited. Minutes passed. An hour. 2. Finally, when I couldn't keep my eyes open any longer, exhaustion pulled me under. Dawn broke in a wash of pale gray light. I forced myself to step outside, scanning the snow for tracks. They were there, circling the cabin, stopping just at the door. But what made my stomach turn was the set leading away, back into the trees, disappearing into the thick pines. Whoever had been out there had stood in the woods for a long time, watching, waiting. I didn't wait to find out if they'd come back. I packed up my things, threw them in the truck, and got the hell out of there. The cabin still belongs to me, but I'll never go back. Some places aren't meant to be lived in. Some things aren't meant to be seen. And whatever was out there in the woods that night, it wasn't done watching me. I hadn't been back to my uncle's farm in years. I used to visit when I was a kid, running through the overgrown fields, climbing into the old barn, and spending long, quiet nights in the cabin at the far end of the property. It was nothing fancy, just a small wooden structure with a couple of rooms and a wood stove, but it always had this strange, isolated feeling to it. The farm had been abandoned for nearly a decade. My uncle passed away, and no one in the family had the time or money to maintain the land. Nature had reclaimed most of it. Fences had rotted away, the dirt road leading up to the house was barely visible, and the main farmhouse itself was falling apart. I came back for one reason. I had just gone through a rough breakup, and I needed time alone. I figured I could spend a few weeks at the cabin, clearing my head, fixing it up, and maybe deciding what to do with the property. It wasn't a great plan, but it was the only one I had. I arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun was dipping behind the trees. The air smelled like damp earth and old wood. The first thing I noticed was how silent everything was. Not in a peaceful way, just empty. The kind of silence that presses against your ears. The cabin was still standing, but it looked worse than I remembered. The door was swollen from the weather, the windows were covered in grime, and the inside smelled like dust and mildew. I set my bags down and got to work, sweeping out the dirt, clearing cobwebs, and making sure there weren't any animals nesting inside. By the time I got a small fire going in the stove, the sun had set and the temperature had dropped. I sat on the old wooden chair, staring into the flames, listening to the wind outside. It was peaceful for a while. Then I heard something, a thump against the side of the cabin. At first, I thought it was just a tree branch or maybe an animal. I listened for a few minutes but didn't hear anything else. The wind howled through the trees, making the walls creak. I told myself it was nothing. That night, I barely slept. The mattress was stiff, and every sound outside made me jump. The roof creaked, the trees rustled, and I kept hearing faint noises. Branches snapping, footsteps in the dirt, something brushing against the walls. The next morning, I forced myself to go outside and look around. There were no signs of anyone or anything, just the same empty fields, the same decaying structures. The second day was spent working. I cleared out more of the cabin, patched up a hole in the roof, and chopped some firewood. By the time the sun started setting, I was exhausted. My muscles ached, and I was looking forward to just sitting by the fire and resting. Then, just as I was bringing the last pile of wood inside, I noticed something. Footprints. They weren't mine. They came from the tree line, leading toward the cabin. Then they stopped, just a few feet from the porch. There were no footprints leading away. I felt a chill run down my back. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe I had just missed them earlier. Maybe the ground had shifted. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, I locked the door and shut the windows. The wind picked up again, howling through the trees. The fire crackled, and I tried to focus on that, ignoring the sounds outside. Then came the knocking. It wasn't loud, just 3 slow, deliberate knocks against the wooden door. I sat completely still, my heart hammering. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The knocks came again. I reached for the old rifle my uncle had kept in the cabin. I hadn't checked if it still worked, but just having it in my hands made me feel a little better. I waited. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Nothing else happened. Eventually, I forced myself to get some sleep, keeping the rifle within arm's reach. The next morning, I checked the door. There were no marks, no footprints, nothing to prove someone had been there. I told myself I was imagining things. By the 3rd day, I was uneasy but determined to stay. I spent the day outside, walking the property, trying to push away the creeping fear. I checked the barn, the old farmhouse, nothing seemed out of place. Then I found something near the tree line. Pile of bones. Small ones, maybe from a rabbit or a bird. They were arranged in a strange pattern, like someone had placed them there on purpose. My stomach turned. I didn't touch them. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing noises, footsteps circling the cabin, slow and deliberate. Every time I grabbed the rifle and checked outside, there was nothing. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I packed up my things, locked the cabin, and started the long drive back to town. As I reached the main road, I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. Someone was standing at the edge of the tree line, watching me. I didn't slow down. I never went back. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. And I'll never forget the feeling of being watched. That silent, waiting presence just beyond the trees. The farm belonged to my uncle, but whatever was out there, it didn't belong to me, and I wasn't going to fight for it. I left, and I never looked back. I never liked taking long trips alone, but I had no choice this time. My job had pushed me to the edge, and I needed a break. A friend of mine owned a small cabin deep in the mountains, about a 6-hour drive from the city. It was isolated, with nothing but thick forest and winding dirt roads for miles. That's exactly what I needed. Somewhere quiet, far away from everything and everyone. The cabin wasn't in bad shape, though it had been sitting empty for a couple of years. My friend said it had all the essentials: a bed, a fireplace, running water, and a gas stove. No electricity, no phone signal. That part made me a little uneasy, but I told myself it was a good thing. No emails, no phone calls, no distractions. Just me, the woods, and some peace for a few days. I packed light, some food, a flashlight, a knife, and a few other essentials. I made sure to bring extra batteries and a small battery-powered radio, just in case. I left early in the morning, hoping to reach the cabin before sunset. The drive started off fine. Smooth highways, clear skies, and good weather. But as I got deeper into the mountains, the roads became rougher, the trees grew denser, and the air got colder. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already starting to dip behind the mountains. The place looked just like my friend had described, small but sturdy, with a single porch and a few steps leading up to the front door. There was a tiny shed off to the side, probably full of old tools or firewood. The nearest town was at least 40 miles away. I parked the truck, grabbed my bag, and headed inside. The place smelled like old wood and dust, but it was cozy enough. The fireplace had a pile of wood stacked next to it, and there was even a small kitchen with a gas stove and some canned food left behind. Everything seemed normal. I spent the first couple of hours getting settled in, sweeping off the dust and airing the place out. Once it got dark, I started a fire, heated up some food, and sat down with my flashlight and a book. That's when I heard something outside. First, I ignored it. The wind had picked up a little, and the trees were swaying. But then I heard it again. Something moving in the brush, close to the cabin. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I turned off the flashlight and listened. It was quiet for a moment. Then the footsteps started again. They weren't the light steps of a small animal. It sounded heavier. Someone was out there. I grabbed my knife and stood up. The fire in the fireplace crackled, the only sound inside. My truck was parked just outside the cabin, and for a second, I thought about making a run for it. But if someone was out there, they'd see me coming. I decided to wait. The footsteps stopped. Minutes passed. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a soft scraping sound against the wall of the cabin. Something or someone was right outside. I moved as quietly as I could to the window. The firelight made it hard to see, so I crouched down to keep from casting a shadow. The porch was empty, but I had the feeling that whoever was out there wasn't far. Then I saw it, a figure standing near the tree lean, just barely visible in the moonlight. It was too dark to make out details, but I could tell it was a man. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. I stayed crouched, barely breathing. After what felt like forever, the figure finally moved, disappearing into the trees. I waited for a long time before I finally stood up, my legs stiff from crouching. I didn't sleep much that night. Every little sound outside made me jump. I kept the knife within reach, listening to the wind howl through the trees. I told myself it was probably just some local hiker or hunter passing through. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The next morning, I stepped outside, scanning the area. Nothing looked disturbed, but when I walked around to the side of the cabin, I saw them, footprints. Large, deep ones, leading from the trees to the wall of the cabin and then back again. Someone had been right outside my cabin. I felt exposed, standing there in the daylight. Whoever had been watching me last night might still be around. I decided to leave as soon as possible. I went inside and packed my bag. As I was about to grab my keys, I glanced at the window. That's when I noticed it. There was something on the glass, a smudged handprint. It was fresh. I didn't waste another second. I grabbed my keys, ran outside, and jumped into the truck. The engine roared to life, and I threw it into reverse, my tires kicking up dirt as I sped down the trail. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight they hurt. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone standing on the road behind me, but I never did. I told my friend about it later. He swore that no one ever went near that cabin, said he'd never seen another soul out there in all the years he owned it. I don't know if I believe that. All I know is that I'll never go back. I had been driving for hours by the time I finally saw the turnoff. A narrow dirt road, barely wide enough for my rental car, disappeared into the dense French countryside. My GPS had stopped working miles back, leaving me with only the directions I had scribbled down on a piece of paper. It was supposed to be a simple getaway. 4 nights in a cabin, away from work, away from the stress of daily life. The cabin belonged to an old friend of my father's, a man I had met once as a child but hadn't spoken to in years. His name was Jacques, and he had insisted I use the place while he was away. It was deep in the woods, isolated, peaceful. Exactly what I needed. As I drove deeper into the forest, the road got worse. Potholes, loose gravel, and overgrown branches scraped against the sides of the car. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the road, making everything feel colder, quieter. I hadn't passed another house or car in at least an hour. It was just me, the trees, and the rhythmic hum of my tires over the uneven road. By the time I reached the cabin, the sky was a deep shade of blue, the last traces of daylight disappearing behind the treetops. The cabin itself was small but sturdy, built of thick logs with a slanted tin roof. A single window faced the driveway, its glass reflecting the dim light of my headlights. There was a porch with a rocking chair, a stack of firewood neatly piled against the side of the house, and an old shed a few meters away. I killed the engine and stepped out. The air was damp and cold, carrying the scent of wet leaves and earth. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the faint sound of running water. A stream, maybe. Other than that, there was nothing. No birds, no wind, just silence. I grabbed my bag and made my way to the front door, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. The key was exactly where Jacques had said it would be, tucked under a loose stone by the door. The lock clicked open easily, and I stepped inside. The inside of the cabin was simple. A single room with a small kitchenette, a wood stove, and a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. The floor was made of thick, uneven planks, the walls lined with old hunting rifles and faded photographs. A small table sat beneath the window, with two mismatched chairs pushed underneath. I set my bag down and flicked on the light. A dim yellow glow filled the room. The electricity worked, which was a relief, but there was no Wi-Fi, no service. I hadn't expected much, but still, the complete lack of connection made me uneasy. I moved to the wood stove, checking the pile of logs stacked beside it. They were dry enough, so I started a fire. The cabin was cold, the air inside stale. As the flames crackled to life, I pulled off my jacket and took a deep breath. This was fine. This was what I had wanted. A break from everything. But something about the silence outside started to bother me. It was too quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant calls of animals. Just complete, absolute stillness. I tried to shake it off. I made a quick meal, eating at the table while staring out the window. The trees stood motionless, their dark silhouettes blending together in the night. At some point, I decided to step outside for some air. I grabbed a flashlight and pushed the door open, stepping onto the porch. The night was colder than before, the damp air clinging to my skin. I listened. Nothing. Then, as I turned to head back inside, I heard it. A single, deliberate footstep in the woods. I froze. It wasn't an animal. It was too heavy, too precise. I held my breath, scanning the darkness. My flashlight barely cut through the thick blackness of the trees. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. Then another step. Closer. I took a step back, gripping the flashlight tighter. It's nothing, I told myself. Probably just my mind playing tricks. I turned to go inside, locking the door behind me. I forced myself to ignore it, to push away the unease creeping up my spine. But I kept the flashlight close, my ears tuned to every little noise. Hours passed. The fire burned low, the room growing colder. I hadn't heard anything else, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. I went to bed but left the light on. The silence stretched on, unbroken, until sometime after midnight. Then, just as I was finally drifting off, a soft scrape against the window. My eyes snapped open. I didn't move. Another scrape. Slow. Deliberate. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see the window. Nothing. But I knew something had been there. I sat up slowly, every nerve in my body on edge. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it at the glass. The beam caught something. A faint smudge, like a handprint smeared across the outside of the window. I swallowed hard. I had locked the door, closed all the windows. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. Then I heard it again. Not from the window this time, from the door. A slow, careful creak, like pressure being applied to the wood. I held my breath. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to break in. They were testing it, seeing if it was locked. I stood as quietly as I could, my heart hammering against my ribs. My mind raced. What did they want? Why were they just standing there? Then, finally, the sound of footsteps retreating. Slow, measured steps moving back toward the trees. I waited, listened. Nothing. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping a knife I had found in the kitchen. Every noise made me flinch. Every creak of the cabin settling made my pulse spike. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I moved cautiously to the door. I unlocked it and stepped outside. There were footprints, deep, fresh prints in the damp earth, leading from the trees to the window, then to the door, then back into the woods. I didn't stay another night. I packed my things, got in my car, and left without looking back. I don't know who it was. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know one thing: they never knocked. They never spoke. They only watched. And they were waiting to see if I would open the door. I don't think I'll ever go back to that cabin again. I was never the type to scare easily. I spent most of my life hunting, fishing, and camping in places where a lot of people would feel uneasy. Being alone in the woods never bothered me. In fact, I preferred it that way. I liked the quiet, the stillness, the way the air felt untouched by the rest of the world. That's why, when my friend Paul told me about an old hunting cabin deep in the forests of Montana, I didn't hesitate to take him up on the offer. It was his uncle's place, an old structure built decades ago, barely standing but still usable. Paul had been there a few times before, but he said it wasn't really his thing, too isolated, too much upkeep. He figured I might get some use out of it. The timing was perfect. It was late September, right before the real cold settled in, and the deer season was open. I planned to stay out there for a full week. Just me, my rifle, and the wilderness. I packed light, just the essentials. Rifle, ammo, sleeping bag, canned food, a few bottles of water, and a small generator to keep my flashlight and radio charged. Paul had warned me there was no running water, and the old wood stove was the only source of heat. That didn't bother me. I had spent nights in far worse conditions. Getting there was an ordeal. The cabin was deep in the woods, far from any main road. I had to drive 2 hours past the nearest town, then another 30 minutes down a barely visible dirt path that looked like it hadn't been used in years. My truck barely made it through. If it rained, I wasn't sure I'd be able to drive back out. The place was exactly what I expected: small, run down, but still standing. It had a single room with a bunk in the corner, a wood stove, and a table with 2 chairs. The walls were made of rough logs, and the roof sagged in a few places. A rusted axe was buried in a stump outside, and a small stack of firewood was left beside the door. I settled in quickly, unloading my gear and stacking up more firewood before nightfall. The first night was uneventful. I sat by the stove, ate a can of beans, and listened to the sounds of the forest. The wind moved through the trees in that slow, steady way that always put me at ease. The first sign that something was wrong happened on the second night. I had spent the day tracking deer, moving deep into the woods, but I hadn't gotten a shot. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was already setting. I set my rifle by the door and got the fire going. That's when I noticed something strange. The stack of firewood I had left outside was different. I had stacked it in a neat pile earlier that morning, but now the logs were scattered. Some were missing. It looked like someone had taken a few and left the rest in a mess. At first, I thought maybe an animal had gotten into it, but there were no tracks, no signs of anything digging through. Just the logs moved. I tried not to think too much about it. Maybe I had just been in a hurry and hadn't stacked them as neatly as I remembered. I went inside, locked the door, and went to sleep. The next morning, I found more things out of place. My backpack, which I had left on the table, was on the floor. One of my water bottles was missing. The door, which I had locked, was slightly open. I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Unease. I checked outside, looking for any sign of footprints. The ground was soft from last night's frost, and it should have been easy to see tracks. But there was nothing. No human footprints, no animal tracks. It was like nothing had been there at all. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I had been careless. Maybe I hadn't locked the door as tightly as I thought. I tried to brush it off, but something in my gut told me something was wrong. That night, I stayed awake longer than usual. I kept the fire low and sat by the window watching the woods. I don't know what I expected to see. It was past midnight when I heard it. A noise outside. It wasn't loud, just a soft crunch, like a footstep on frozen leaves. I grabbed my rifle and waited, listening. Then another sound. This time it was closer. I stood up, moving to the window as quietly as I could. The moon was bright, casting long shadows through the trees. I scanned the tree line, looking for movement. First, I didn't see anything. Then I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the trees. It was too dark to make out any details, but I could tell it was a man. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The man stood there for what felt like an eternity. Then, without a sound, he turned and walked back into the trees. I waited, heart pounding, but he never came back. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my things quickly, shoving everything into my backpack. I stepped outside, rifle in hand, scanning the area. Then I saw it. Footprints. They led from the woods to my cabin, stopping just outside the door. I followed them with my eyes, heart hammering. They didn't go back. Whoever had been there had never left. I didn't waste another second. I threw my pack in the truck, started the engine, and drove out as fast as the path would allow. I never looked back. When I finally got back to town, I told Paul about what happened. He looked uncomfortable but not surprised. "I should have warned you," he admitted. "My uncle stopped going up there for a reason." I asked him why, but he wouldn't say. He just shook his head and told me I had done the right thing by leaving. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who or what was out there that night, and I don't want to find out.